That kind of trash like you was born only to know the smell of burning flesh. He gripped the boy's wrist tight, the lighter flaring to life like a cold sentence. The stench of scorched young skin mixed with screams tearing through the street, while he laughed in delight, the flames casting a vicious glow across his face. From the far end of the street a roar thundered, "Let my son go, Cain, before I burn your whole rotten life to the ground." The midday sun beat down on the forecourt of the convenience store, the asphalt radiating waves of heat that made the air dense and suffocating. Malik, a 10-year-old boy with wide, jet-black eyes, stood pressed under the store's awning, clutching a cold drink can he had just bought, waiting for his father to return from the parking lot. He pressed the can to his cheek to ward off the sweltering heat, his gaze wandering innocently over the passing crowd. Everything seemed ordinary until a tall figure emerged from across the street. Travis Kane, a white police officer with a tense face and piercing, cold eyes, walked straight toward Malik. His presence carried no sense of protection, only something sharp-edged and steeped in suspicion. Kane stopped in front of Malik, narrowing his eyes as if trying to see through the boy's skin to uncover some hidden crime. His voice was hoarse, but laced with a cold disdain. "What are you hiding in your pocket?" Malik flinched slightly, glancing down at his shorts before looking up and slowly shaking his head. He hadn't managed a word of explanation before Kane stepped closer, the stench of stale cigarettes and sweat hitting his nose. Kane's gaze wasn't searching for truth, it had already decided guilt. Without warning, the man's rough hand clamped down on Malik's small wrist. The boy let out a soft cry of pain, but Kane only smirked a smile devoid of humor, filled instead with contempt. "You want to know what it feels like to be caught red-handed?" The words cut through the sweltering air, as if this were some twisted game he knew well. Malik tried to pull away, but the man's strength was many times greater, making escape impossible. Then, like someone who had already passed sentence, Kane pulled a silver lighter from his shirt pocket. He flicked it open, his thumb brushing the wheel. A dry click rang out, and a small but vivid blue-orange flame leapt to life. Malik's eyes widened instinct, warning him of something terrible about to happen. Kane said nothing more, just stared at the boy with an icy look before bringing the flame close to the palm he held trapped. The stench of burning skin rose instantly, mingling with the faint reek of lighter fluid cutting through the air. Malik screamed the sound, tearing through the stifling afternoon and echoing off the convenience store windows. His vision blurred with tears and pain, his hand straining to pull back but still locked in an iron grip. The searing agony stabbed like hundreds of needles at once, spreading up his small arm. People nearby began to turn, some frozen in shock, others gaping in disbelief at the scene unfolding before them. An elderly woman nearby dropped her grocery bag to the tiled ground, the clatter of its contents ignored by all. There were gasps, whispers, and broken questions, but Kane remained unmoving, his hand gripping Malik's wrist like a vice, the flame still dancing as if burning not just flesh, but the innocence of a child. Malik sobbed, each breath hitching with pain and panic. The can he had been holding slipped from his grasp, rolling across the floor and leaving a cold, wet trail that could save nothing. His eyes searched desperately for his father, but found only Kane's frozen face and the unblinking stares of passers-by. Above, the sky seemed to darken in that instant, though the sun still blazed. Somewhere, a piercing scream rang out, snapping the attention of those frozen in place. But before Malik could realize who had screamed, Kane released his grip as if completing some brutal ritual. The flame died in his hand, leaving behind the stench of charred flesh hanging in the air, and Malik's palm glowing red, blistered from the burn. He clutched his injured hand, tears streaming, breaths broken, his mind spinning between pain and fear. The murmurs grew louder, someone whispering, "My God, what did he just do?" A phone was raised its lens, trembling as it began recording everything. Kane glanced toward them, his mouth curling into a confident smirk as if no consequence could touch him. To him, this was nothing more than another sweltering day, and a boy of different skin had just been taught a lesson with fire. Malik remained standing there, trembling struggling, clutching his hand, forcing his sobs back down. In his mind, the image of the flame replayed over and over, an invisible scar etched deep. Outside, life carried on, the hum of car engines, the beeps of a store scanner. But to Malik, the world had shifted into a place where safety could be burned away in an instant by someone wearing the badge of law. All eyes were fixed on Kane and Malik, the space between them thick and stifling. And in the distance, past rows of parked cars, a figure was running toward them, eyes wide with panic and rage. But for Malik, this moment was already nailed into memory, the moment he learned that not all who wore a uniform came to protect. Malik still trembled, his burned red palm trying to pull back, but Kane's grip was like an iron vise. The boy's choked sobs spilled out heavy and strangled in his throat, not forming full cries, only breaking into shaky breaths. Kane leaned in closer, his crooked smile gleaming with the satisfaction of someone holding a cruel toy. Black and this weak, the words landed like a well-sharpened blade, cutting deep into the boy's heart. Malik felt every breath freeze in his chest, each syllable falling heavier in his ears than the flame still gnawing at his flesh. He didn't fully understand the meaning, but the tone and the look were enough to tell him he'd just been reduced to trash. In the thick, stifling air, the sound of rapid, heavy footsteps rose from a distance, each one pounding with the weight of urgency and rage. It was nothing like an ordinary walk. It carried the force of a storm closing in. Kane flicked his eyes toward the sound, but still refused to release Malik, as if daring the world to try and stop him. Malik turned his tear-streaked face, cheeks flushed from heat and pain, and saw his father, Jordan Pierce, charging toward them. Jordan's face was drawn tight, his eyes lit with a mix of horror and mountain fury. Sweat clung to his shirt, but nothing slowed his steps. Malik wanted to call out, but his throat seized, leaving only a silent plea in his gaze. Kane shifted fully, keeping Malik in front of him like a shield, his eyes locking on Jordan and holding there. For a moment, the two men stood across less than 10 yards of space that felt like a battlefield. Kane's mouth curled not in politeness, but in a thin, malicious smirk dripping with challenge. "Planning to teach me a lesson. The way you taught him," he said, each word deliberate, his voice lowered just enough to make the contempt clear. Jordan paused for half a second, his breath tight, then quickened his pace, eyes fixed on his son's trapped hand. The bystanders stayed clustered around, some backing away in tension, others lifting their phones' lenses, shaken with pounding hearts. Kane saw it all, but didn't flinch. He seemed to savor the attention. Malik could feel his father's heartbeat in his stare, fast, strong, and resolute. But he also sensed something dangerous in Kane, a lurking intent to tear past every limit. Kane's grip tightened, making Malik wince, and he tilted his head with a thin laugh. "Look at him. This is what you raised. To cry in the middle of the street." Those nearby heard every word. A few soft, "Oh my God," saw slipping out, whispers of outrage trading between friends. But no one stepped forward because Kane's eyes carried not just aggression but a silent warning that he was ready to go much further if provoked. Jordan stopped a few steps from Kane, his voice hoarse and lowered like a warning. Yet his eyes still held the ache of a father's concern for his son. "Let him go, Kane. Right now." Kane let out a short dry laugh like stones rolling, then pressed each word with deliberate weight. "Or do you want me to teach him a few more lessons?" The words were like oil thrown onto the fire, burning in Jordan's eyes. Malik shuddered the burn in his hand, throbbing in waves, yet the physical pain was eclipsed by the fear of seeing the two men face each other, each carrying a different kind of power. He could only glance back and forth, hoping for some miracle to free his trapped hand. But Kane still didn't let go his gaze, dropping to Malik's blistered palm before lifting again as if to dig deeper into Jordan's helplessness. "You seem to care a lot about him, but you know what? Out there, nobody cares. A black kid gets hurt. What's so Joe knew about that. His words fell into the open air but struck every ear nearby, leaving a sting of disgust and unease. Jordan clenched his fists but held himself in check, knowing that a single wrong move would cost Malik immediately. The tension rose so sharply it felt as if everyone could hear blood rushing in their veins. Malik panted, his vision beginning to blur from pain and fear. But somewhere in his father's eyes he caught a glimmer, the glimmer of someone who would never abandon him no matter the opponent. No one in the crowd dared to breathe hard. The air squeezed tight in those few seconds. Kane dipped his head slightly, his eyes narrow in his stare, locked on Jordan as if trying to read his next move. But even in that fleeting moment, Malik felt certain the battle had already begun, and the flame on his hand was only the first spark in a storm about to sweep over them all. The sound of a car siren echoed from afar, bouncing off the brick walls of the shop rows, blending with the sweltering gusts blowing across the steaming asphalt. The burnt smell from Malik's hand still lingered, mixed with the scent of street dust and a faint trace of engine oil in the air. Storefront signs rattled lightly in the wind, the metallic clinks colliding in a way that scraped the nerves. Under the sun that seemed intent on melting the ground, the scene grew heavier. Every movement slowed, yet strung tight like a wire about to snap. Jordan Pierce, sweat beading on his forehead, pushed forward in urgent strides toward his son, his breath sinking with the pounding of his heart. He heard nothing else now but the rush of blood in his ears, and the sight of Malik's small hand gripped by a man draped in the authority of law, but wielding it to destroy. "Let go of my son now." Jordan's voice rang out, no longer a request, but a command, sharp enough to make a few nearby people step back. Each word fell like a hammer strike, carrying both rage and the pain surging within. Malik looked up at his father, his eyes red from tears and burning with the heat of pain that hadn't eased. But Travis Kane didn't move back. He stood firm like a wall of flesh, his frame blocking part of the sunlight, casting a shadow across Malik's face. In his other hand, the glint of metal cuffs caught the light, reflecting a cold gleam, trembling slightly like a warning. "Resisting an officer is against the law." Kane's voice was slow, each word pushed through clenched teeth, loud enough for both Jordan and the crowd to hear. He lifted his chin, his eyes fixed on Jordan as if testing whether his opponent would shrink or ignite. The crowd murmured, some covering their mouths, some raising phones, lenses pointed straight at the two men locked in a standoff. The sound of recording devices mixed with the swirling wind, all of it forming the backdrop to this clash of power. "Dad, my hand hurts so much," Malik's voice cracked, each trembling note cutting through the heavy air. His blurred eyes still searched for Jordan, desperate for the familiar safety he knew. Jordan heard him, and his steps quickened, each stride slicing through the remaining space. His eyes stayed locked on Malik's trapped hand, then rose to meet Kane's stare. In that moment, their gazes collided like two blades slamming together, sending invisible sparks into the sweltering air. Jordan felt every heartbeat pulsing with the heat of the street, but across from him, Kane stood just as solid-armed, with the confidence of someone who believed he held the upper hand. He stepped forward, slightly raising the hand with the cuffs as if to make his intent unmistakable. One choice: stay put, swallow the fury, or take another step and become the one resisting in front of both the crowd and the cameras. Malik sobbed in broken bursts, his breath hitching, sweat running down his temples to mix with his tears. Jordan saw it clearly, and in his mind every image since he had started running overlapped Malik waiting outside the store. The flash of blue flame, the scream of pain, and now his son's desperate voice calling to him. Kane still wore that thin smile, one laced with contempt and a trace of enjoyment, as if he wanted to stretch this moment out just to savor it. The sweltering wind swept past, spinning scraps of old newspaper in dry, rustling circles at their feet. Somewhere farther off, The sound of a siren rose again, closer this time, making a few people glance around as if expecting another authority to arrive. But here, in the circle of staring eyes, there were only three central figures. A boy with a burning hand, a father holding himself back on the edge of an explosion, and a police officer milking every ounce of power to dominate. Jordan drew in a slow breath, his eyes still locked on Kane. "I'll say it again. Let go of my son." His voice was not raised, but each word dropped hard like stones into boiling water. Kane tilted his head slightly, a flicker of mockery in his eyes, then lowered his voice just enough for those nearby to hear. "Who do you think you're giving me orders here?" The words hissed out, blending with the wind and the faint clink of metal from the cuffs still hanging in his hand. A few in the crowd clenched their fists, one muttered "God," but no one stepped forward. They understood this wasn't just a scuffle or an arrest. It was a collision between two kinds of power, one handed down by law, the other built through credibility and justice. And it was obvious, even without knowing exactly who Jordan Pierce was, that the way he stood, looked, and defended his son was not the way of an ordinary man being pushed around. Malik whimpered again, a small sound that stabbed straight into Jordan's chest. He stepped closer, the distance now only a few breaths apart. Kane glanced down, squeezing Malik's hand tighter, a warning that any rash move would mean more pain for the boy. The noon sun, angled sharply, cast in half of Kane's face in light and the other half in shadow, making him look even more like a man standing on the line between good and evil, but who had long since chosen the dark. Jordan knew every passing second tightened the tension, but he also knew there was no retreat. Malik was watching him, eyes holding both pain and trust. Kane was watching him too, eyes full of challenge and anticipation. And around them, a ring of witnesses' cameras aimed and ready to capture every moment of this standoff. In that brief instant, the sky seemed to hold still, leaving only the sound of heartbeats breathing and the heat of the street pressing all of them to the very edge. Jordan lunged forward, his hand trembling as it touched Malik's small arm. He gently lifted his son's hand, and the sight before him made his blood boil. The tender skin was scorched, bright red blisters beginning to rise, the heat still radiating as if it had just been pressed into a flame. The smell of burned flesh, mixed with the stifling heat of the street, tightened Jordan's throat. Malik curled his fingers, trying to stifle a groan because he knew his father was watching, but the tears in his eyes spoke the pain for him. Jordan could feel his son's heartbeat racing, not only from the physical agony, but from the fear closing in. He placed his other hand softly on the back of Malik's neck as reassurance, but before he could say a word, his whole body was jolted violently. Kane shoved Jordan's shoulder, the rough push forcing him a step back. He barked, his voice booming across the forecourt. "Leave the scene now." The shout was aimed not only at Jordan, but carried like an order over the entire crowd. Some people flinched, a few stepped back, but many eyes stayed fixed on the scene. The tension didn't lift, it only thickened like the air before a heavy storm. Jordan straightened, saying nothing, his eyes still locked on Kane, lips pressed so tight that a vein stood out at his temple. In that charged air, a middle-aged woman in a light-colored blouse stood near the curb, her phone's camera already recording. She stepped forward slightly, her voice ringing out loud and clear over the surrounding noise. "You're abusing a child." The words struck at the heart of the scene, prompting ripples in the crowd, murmurs of agreement mixed with sharp intakes of breath. Many eyes shifted from Malik's injured hand to Kane's face as if waiting to see his reaction. Kane snapped his head toward her, his gaze turning icy. In an instant, he stepped toward the woman, his hand snatching her phone so quickly she didn't have time to react. Her startled hey was swallowed by his next move. He hurled the phone to the tiled ground. The sharp crack of shattering glass rang out, echoing like a dry gunshot in the thick air. Fragments scattered a few skittering to the feet of the crowd. A brief silence fell then, was replaced by a surge of loud whispers. onlookers. Some gasped sharply, others cursed under their breath, shocked and angry eyes sweeping across the circle of onlookers. A young man in the crowd lifted his phone higher silently, showing that he was still recording. A few other hands followed, rising quietly but defiantly. Kane's glance flicked over them, the corner of his mouth curling in an unreadable way before he turned back to face Jordan. The aggression still burned in his eyes, but for the first time a faint edge of tension crossed them, as if he was beginning to register the tightening ring of cameras around him. Jordan stood his ground, his hand covering Malik's burned palm to shield it from the wind and sun. The smell of charred flesh still lingered, a stain clinging to the air that nothing could clear away. He knew every passing second was another second Malik had to endure, but also another second that could shift the balance. The raised phones around them were a double-edged blade, able to serve as proof, yet just as capable of triggering a reckless reaction from Kane. And Jordan understood that if Kane lost control again, the damage would not stop at his son's hand. Another wave of hot wind swept through spinning scraps of torn paper across the ground, the cautious shuffling of onlookers pressing in mixed with the heavy rhythm of Malik's breathing. Kane's gaze swept over the scene, and he drew in a deep breath as if to steady himself, yet his grip on the cuffs remained tight, the steel flashing under the harsh midday light. Jordan didn't blink, the muscles in his face drawn taut, but when he spoke, his voice was low and firm as steel. "You just burned a child's hand, Kane, and you think you'll walk away from it." The words landed hard, silencing part of the crowd and drawing their full focus to the two men. Malik, though gasping through the pain, lifted his head, sensing the unshakable resolve his father was passing to him. Kane, in contrast, gave a short derisive laugh, though it now carried a hint of strain, as if the tightening ring of cameras had brushed against his instinct for self-preservation. Still, he kept his defiant stance, taking a small step closer to Jordan, the gap between them now only a few handspans. The sunlight poured down, striking both faces, set against each other, one burning with rage, the other flaring with the heat of challenged authority. Malik stood in between his bright red hand, still trembling within his father's grip, the sweat on his brow dripping onto the tiles like invisible drops of blood, and the surrounding circle of onlookers closed in further, each gaze holding the same awareness they were witnessing a moment where a single word, a single movement could make everything explode. Jordan stood there, his breath coiled tight in his chest, each deep inhale like a thin thread keeping him from lunging straight at Kane. His eyes never left the face of the man who had just burned his son's hand, his gaze sharp, as if peeling away every false layer wrapped around him. The air between them was so dense that a single blink could shatter the restraint holding it together. Sweat slid from Jordan's temple down his cheek, but he didn't bother to wipe it. Every sense was locked on Kane's slightest movement, the smallest shift in his expression. Outside, the sun still poured down like fire, but its heat was nothing compared to the blaze running through Jordan's veins. Kane stepped closer, each deliberately slow stride, striking the tiled ground with a heavy thud, like hammering nails into the space between them. When the gap shrank to just an arm's length, he lowered his voice loud enough for Jordan to hear, but still reaching a few nearby ears. "You people will never win." The words carried a cold triumph, not the noise of a threat, but the dangerous certainty of someone long accustomed to twisting power to their will. Jordan felt each syllable as if carved into his skin, and the only thing keeping him rooted was Malik's gaze, full of pain, yet anchored in trust. At the edge of the crowd, a young man in a dark t-shirt had been holding his phone up for some time, but now he moved with subtle precision, slipping between people to get closer to the center. His fingers slid quickly over the screen, and seconds later, in the upper left corner, the bright red live icon appeared. The camera locked on Kane, catching his face in the harsh sunlight, his eyes brimming with contempt. The young man said nothing, holding the phone steady, his hands trembling slightly as he realized he was capturing a moment thousands would see instantly. Around him, the air seemed to thicken, and those nearby glanced at his screen, noticing the viewer count jumping rapidly from hundreds to thousands in just seconds. Kane hadn't noticed yet. He kept his focus on Jordan like a predator fixed on its prey. But then, a small movement at the edge of his vision drew his head, and he caught sight of the phone aimed directly at him. His eyes darkened in an instant, irritation flashing hard. He strode toward the young man, his rough hand seizing the boy's shoulder and shoving hard. The sudden force sent the young man staggering back, nearly toppling to the tiles. The sound of shoes and limbs striking the ground rang clear, met with gasps from the crowd. Kane didn't realize that the act had been caught clean on camera, and more importantly that the footage was streaming out to thousands of watching eyes around the world. On the young man's screen, comments scrolled too fast to read curses, calls to bring in higher police, blunt orders like, "Arrest him and don't let him get away." The viewer count surged higher, still passing 10,000 as Kane remained unaware. Jordan saw the shove, and in that instant he realized the circle was shifting. The truth was no longer trapped in the sweltering heat of the forecourt. It was spreading, flowing into hundreds, thousands of living rooms, cafes, and offices somewhere out there. Every watching eye was now a witness, every comment a spark waiting to ignite. And Kane, though standing only a few steps away, had no idea he had just thrown himself into the center of that fire. Malik still leaned against his father, his burned hand shielded beneath Jordan's as if behind a small armor. The boy looked up, catching the gaze of the young man holding the phone, and though pain marked his face, his lips trembled as if to say something. Jordan gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze, a silent reassurance that things were shifting. The crowd began to murmur louder, some stepping in closer, no longer keeping the cautious distance they had before. The heavy air now carried a faint current, as if everyone could sense something moving toward an irreversible point. Kane turned back his gaze, sweeping across a crowd now thick with raised phones. He froze for half a second, and in that fleeting moment Jordan caught a small crack in the mask of confidence he wore. But Kane quickly covered it, tightening his grip on the cuffs as if to remind everyone he still held control. Yet the phones remained, the eyes stayed fixed on him, and thousands of people out there were still watching his every move, every gesture in real time. The sun kept pouring down, casting light over tense faces, and Jordan knew with clarity the final squeeze wasn't coming from him, but from Kane himself, the man unknowingly building his own indictment minute by minute before a court he didn't even realize existed, the court of public opinion. Just hours after the live stream from the forecourt of the convenience store went out, the online space exploded. What began as a few hundred shares from direct witnesses quickly spread into tens of thousands, leaping beyond the town, crossing state lines. On Facebook, local community groups overflowed with posts containing the video, each one a version of the same truth: a 10-year-old boy held by a police officer and burned with a lighter in broad daylight. No one needed to embellish or edit it. The images alone were horrific enough to ignite outrage. Every share was like a fresh spark extending a chain of fire no one could put out. Twitter became the epicenter, with short but blistering tweets appearing non-stop. The hashtag #BurnedByTheBadge, a phrase unknown just hours earlier, now sat among the nation's top trending topics. People used it to condemn abuse of power, share Malik's story, and recount their own experiences of police injustice. One single photo, the small hand of Malik wrapped in thick white bandages, only a few swollen red fingers exposed, became the emblem of the movement. It was reposted hundreds of thousands of times, printed on protest posters, and turned into profile pictures. One look at it, and anyone could understand why people were furious. On Instagram, photos from multiple angles of the incident were brightened, captioned, and shared at lightning speed. Some were placed beside an image of Kane, smiling with the words beneath, "This is who they protect." Others paired Malik's hand with the image of a police badge, a flame blazing between them. The stories accompanying the images drew hundreds of thousands of likes, each comment a voice calling for justice. Then, as public outrage surged, a second video suddenly surfaced, sending the wave even higher. This one wasn't from the live stream, but from someone filming at a lower, slightly shaky angle across from the store. It captured the exact moment Cain faced Malik, flicked his thumb, and a blue flame flared to life. In frame, he made no attempt to hide his pleasure. His lips curled into a slow smile, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. The videographer captioned it simply, "When he thought no one was watching." Within 15 minutes of being posted, the second video had passed 1 million views. Online news outlets picked it up, airing it alongside frame-by-frame commentary. Commentators on security and law weighed in, calling it direct evidence of child abuse beyond excuse. Even those who generally defended the police struggled to find words to justify Cain's actions when the clip so plainly revealed intent and enjoyment. On the largest forums, debates raged non-stop. One person wrote, "If there were no phones, this would have been erased like every other time." Another replied, "No, this time he's not getting away." Each comment poured more fuel on the fire of outrage and #burned by. The badge became more than just a hashtag. It was a movement demanding immediate answers. Jordan saw it all. He sat before the computer screen, the light from the video reflecting off his tense face. Every time his son's hand appeared, his chest tightened a mix of pain and fury. But beneath that pain was clarity. This story no longer belonged only to his family. Malik was now the face of thousands of other children who had never been protected in similar moments. Jordan knew this wave might be the only chance not just to win justice for his son, but to force the system itself to face what it had allowed. Out there, social justice groups began coordinating set-in times to post in unison for maximum impact. Many artists, journalists, and famous athletes joined in sharing the video with calls to action. One leading basketball star even posted a photo of Malik's hand on his personal page with the words "Justice for Malik." That single post drew millions of new interactions, taking the story to an international stage. Online interviews began to be scheduled. Some witnesses were ready to appear live on television, recounting every detail from that sweltering day and Cain's coldness as he burned a child. One mother told how her son had once been stopped by Cain while biking home just because he looked like a suspect, and when she asked why, Cain only smiled. Her story, streamed live, brought thousands of comments demanding criminal charges. The flow of information about the case no longer broke. Every hour brought more posts, more images, more stories, adding to the full picture of an officer who had crossed the line many times. Major news outlets began pressing the local police department for an official statement, but the only reply was, "We are investigating." The prolonged silence only fueled the outrage, as everyone knew investigating could mean waiting for the public to cool down. Yet, this time, there were no signs of cooling. More and more people felt this was the moment to hold those in power accountable. From New York to Los Angeles, small protest groups began forming, carrying images of Malik's hand and the hashtag "burned by the badge." At schools, students organized urgent forums inviting lawyers and activists to speak about human rights and child safety. Jordan watched the view count edge toward 10 million. He knew that once it crossed that mark, the story could not be pushed aside. Malik, only 10 years old, was starting to understand he was at the center of something far bigger. He looked at his father and asked in a small but certain voice, "You won't let him do that to anyone else, right?" Jordan leaned down, resting a warm hand on his son's shoulder, not answering directly. But his eyes said everything that needed to be said. Outside, social media stayed a battlefield. Status updates, long posts, analysis videos, and memes all circled the same message. It was time for justice to speak. And as the second video, Cain, smiling as the flame burst to life, continued to spread, it became not only proof of the crime, but a symbol of the arrogance the community was determined to end. The story of Malik's case had not yet cooled when another spark suddenly ignited, this time from the shadows Kane thought he had buried for good. In a closed forum for former law enforcement officers, an anonymous account began posting fragments of information about Kane's past. Claiming to be a former colleague who had left the force years earlier, the poster recounted witnessing an incident of juvenile abuse with Kane at the center. According to the account, 3 years ago in a nearby town, Kane was involved in the arrest of a group of teenagers for property damage. During questioning, he was accused of beating a 14-year-old boy so severely that the boy was hospitalized with head injuries. The report at the time was filed as resisting arrest and quickly closed after the victim's family withdrew their complaint under pressure from an unspecified source. Messages from this account spread rapidly, not only through online communities but also into the hands of journalists closely following Malik's case. Less than a day later, a leaked data package arrived in the inbox of a veteran investigative reporter. Inside were copies of multiple internal files, including complaint reports against Kane throughout his 10-year career. The list was longer than most imagined allegations of racial discrimination, abuse of authority, and excessive use of force during arrests. Each time the files closed with the same dry conclusions: insufficient evidence or actions within the scope of authority. These sterile phrases only fueled public anger as they read like prearranged full stops. When these documents began circulating on social media, outrage flared anew. Many asked how many cases like Malik's had been buried, and how many more, like Kane, still wore the uniform free to harm the very people they had sworn to protect. Hashtags demanding investigation and accountability multiplied with tens of thousands of posts each hour, attaching images of Kane from the shift when Malik was assaulted. The sense of injustice had expanded beyond the recent incident into a sweeping indictment of the system that had kept him in place for so many years. Major news outlets joined in, moving beyond simple coverage of the incident to dig into Kane's background and career. One evening, broadcast devoted 10 full minutes to analyzing the leaked files, interviewing past victims and former colleagues. One anonymous source said everyone in the unit knew he was a problem, but he always had a way of making things disappear. Some investigations were shut down before they even began. That statement was quoted thousands of times, cementing the view that Kane was the product of an enabling system, not just a rogue individual. While public outrage boiled, Kane continued showing up at the precinct in uniform, patrolling as if nothing had happened. No suspension notice, no confirmation of an internal investigation. This silence from the authorities landed like a direct punch to the community's emotions. People felt contempt, watching a man exposed for a string of past abuses still being handed the power and tools to act as before. At night outside the police headquarters, people began to gather. They carried banners, photos of Malik's burned hand, and placards listing the names of other victims they believed had suffered in silence. The chant of "Suspend him now" rang out, mingling with car horns and the beat of drums, forming a relentless sound that carried for hours. Online videos from the protests were shared widely, adding to the growing record that the outrage had spread far beyond the borders of one town. Jordan watched it all from home beside Malik, whose hand was bandaged and who had fallen asleep from pain medication. He read every article, listened to every account from strangers who had now become allies in a fight he never thought he would have to join. Each new revelation about Kane's past made him angrier, but also strengthened his resolve that the truth had to come out, not only to protect his son, but to keep other hands from being burned the way Malik's had been. And as the number of protesters grew and investigative reporting dug deeper, Kane, though still wearing his mask of defiance, began to feel the pressure. The looks from colleagues were no longer the same. Some conversations fell silent when he entered the room, and he caught fragments of whispers about orders from above being prepared. Yet, for now, the fact that he had not been suspended remained an unpulled pin in a live grenade, and the community, like a rising wave, was waiting for the moment to break. One might have thought that after the second video spread across every platform, Kane would avoid cameras, keep silent, and let public outrage fade. But that night, a group of local paparazzi happened to spot him at a small downtown bar. Under dim yellow lights, Kane sat among friends, a half-empty beer bottle before him, his face flushed from alcohol and his grin openly smug. One hand rested on a colleague's shoulder, the other raised his glass in a hard clink, spilling foam over the rim. Cameras flashed rapidly, capturing frames that made it instantly clear he wasn't worried or remorseful. He was enjoying a relaxed evening as if the afternoon's events were nothing more than a harmless joke. Just hours later, the photo of Kane at the bar appeared on Twitter with a short caption, "No remorse." Shares skyrocketed, drawing tens of thousands of furious comments. Many compared two images: Malik's hand wrapped in white bandages, his eyes wide with fear, and Kane drinking beer with a wide grin. "This is the man who burned a child's hand," one user wrote, and this is him hours later, not in an interrogation room but in a bar. What truly reignited the outrage, however, was a new clip posted the following morning. A witness claimed to have accidentally recorded Kane leaving the bar. In the video, he leaned against a wall cigarette between his fingers, chatting with a small group. His voice cut clearly through the quiet night air. "It's just a black kid." Each word fell cold and dismissive, like a knife twisting into the pain and fury already boiling through the community. The clip lasted only 10 seconds, but it was enough to unleash another tidal wave. Those already enraged by his actions that afternoon now had no doubt about Kane's true attitude. No one could claim it was an accident or misunderstanding. He had said it himself, and the statement stamped every accusation of racial bias he faced. Human rights organizations immediately escalated their involvement. They held press conferences, issuing statements demanding a federal investigation into Kane's conduct, not only in Malik's case, but also in previous abuse allegations. Well-known civil rights lawyers appeared on television arguing that this was no longer about a single man, but a raw display of a system that allowed those with racial prejudice to wear uniform and badge. Across major forums, calls to boycott the local police department spread quickly. Residents discussed refusing to cooperate with officers from Kane's precinct while demanding that the mayor and police chief address the public. Several activist groups began planning a large-scale protest for the weekend, aiming to gather thousands in front of City Hall. When Jordan saw the new clip, he felt his blood surge to a breaking point. He had thought he'd reached his limit when he saw his son's hand burned, but Kane's words went beyond any boundary. It wasn't just an insult to Malik, it was an insult to the entire community Jordan belonged to. He knew from this moment forward the case could not be buried under empty promises or internal investigation results. Malik, still recovering at home, struggled to move with his bandaged hand, but his young eyes were beginning to grasp the storm building outside. When he overheard people talking about Kane's remark, he stayed silent for a long time before quietly asking his father, "Why does he hate me so much?" Jordan didn't answer immediately. He sat beside his son, took his uninjured hand, and spoke slowly. "There are people who fear our existence simply because we're different from them, but you're not allowed to fear them." Malik nodded, though the hurt was still written in his eyes. National media had now fully locked onto the story. Evening broadcasts opened with the bar footage paired with Kane's inflammatory words, followed by the image of Malik's bandaged hand. Commentators, analysts, and celebrities voiced sharp opinions, many calling it a moment that tests the public's faith in justice. The outrage had reached a point where even those who had stayed silent felt compelled to speak. Some black police officers in other states expressed their anger, saying Kane's actions and words had tarnished the image of those who truly sought to protect their communities. A few even openly urged their colleagues to side with justice, even if it meant standing against one of their own. Under intense pressure, the mayor's office was forced to announce that they were considering inviting the FBI to join the investigation. Though vague, it was enough to keep the public fire burning. Human rights leaders vowed not to stop until Cain was stripped of his badge and brought to court. From the night at the bar to the words, "It's just a black kid," Cain had made himself a symbol of everything the community wanted to fight against. And once you become the face of hate, there's no going back. The storm he had sparked was now beyond anyone's control, and it was coming straight down the path where he stood. What began as a brief live stream had grown into a movement far beyond the borders of one town. Over the weekend, cities big and small across the United States saw crowds pour into the streets holding banners and chanting for justice for Malik. Above them, flags and posters bearing the image of the boy's bandaged hand fluttered in the wind, the child's eyes in the photo seeming to pierce straight into people's hearts, turning outrage into a rare, united force. From New York to Los Angeles to quiet Midwestern towns, the marches pressed forward, the beat of drums and the cry of justice for Malik echoing off concrete walls and rippling outward like an unstoppable current. Along the streets, groups in shirts printed with "Chat burned by the badge" raised signs bearing the date and time of the incident, turning every intersection into a reminder for anyone passing by. There were mothers pushing strollers alongside their children, veterans leaning on canes, but standing for hours, eyes resolute as if they had long awaited this day. The strength of the movement lay not just in its numbers, but in the faces no longer only from the black community, but a diverse mix of races, ages, and walks of life, united by one message: the one who caused this pain must be held accountable. Celebrities, athletes, and influential voices online joined in. A famous singer appeared at a march in Chicago, holding hands with a mother clutching a photo of Malik speaking into a loudspeaker. "We're here for a child who should never have gone through this." A top basketball player paused his training schedule to post an image of the bandaged hand with the caption, "If my son were Malik, I wouldn't stay silent for a second." Those words were shared millions of times, carrying Malik's image and story onto magazine covers, national television shows, and international news sites. Politicians from local offices to Congress were forced to take a stand. A senator, long silent on cases of police violence, stood before cameras, this time declaring the matter would be brought to a hearing if necessary. Mayors from other states sent letters urging the Department of Justice to launch a federal investigation, calling it a matter of civil rights at a national level. Each live statement encouraged thousands more to take to the streets, turning the wave of outrage into real political pressure. Jordan saw it all on the living room TV, with Malik resting his head on a pillow, eyes wide, as he watched the crowds and the signs bearing his name. Jordan could not hold back the swell of emotion as he realized his son's story was no longer confined to an investigation file or a few cold lines of reporting. It had become the shared voice of a nation hungry for justice. In a quiet moment, he gently squeezed his son's hand, feeling the small but steady heartbeat, and whispered like a promise, "You are not alone." International media began covering the story more heavily, comparing Malik's case to past high-profile incidents of police violence and racial discrimination. Bold headlines appeared on front pages: "America demands justice for 10-year-old boy, a burned hand," the flame that ignited a nationwide movement. The attention made it impossible for federal authorities to remain silent, as inaction now meant accepting damage to the nation's image in the eyes of the world. Protests continued without pause. Marches by day, candlelight vigils by night, the glow of thousands of flames illuminating photos of Malik, and the determination not to let his story fade. On sweat-streaked faces, fear had been replaced by unity, and belief in collective strength outweighed any sense of helplessness. From the pounding footsteps on avenues across the country came a message that needed no translation: justice would have to be done. Pressure from the streets, social media, and the press surged straight into police headquarters. Their email inbox overflowed with tens of thousands of petitions each, a firm demand: fire Travis Kane immediately. Signatures poured in not only from residents of the state, but from communities on both coasts and even Americans living abroad. People wrote of their disgust watching the video, their fury at hearing his words, and their loss of faith in a system that could allow someone like him to keep wearing a badge. Under this pressure, police spokespeople were forced to hold repeated press briefings, but vague statements under investigation or insufficient evidence for immediate suspension only stoked public anger. Every time they appeared on television, news broadcasts paired them with footage of crowds outside headquarters, signs reading "Fire Kane," now held high like a public verdict. Inside department meeting rooms, the atmosphere was so tense that many officers felt that anything they said could be recorded, edited, and posted online. Some spoke bluntly, saying Kane had dragged the whole unit into the storm, further damaging its already fragile credibility. Yet a few voices still defended him, citing the lack of an official conclusion. These arguments were never made public, but everyone knew the cracks were spreading inside. Meanwhile, Jordan remained silent. Throughout the days of swelling protests and mounting pressure on Kane, he stayed out of the media, keeping close to Malik and the family. A few persistent reporters waited outside his home hoping for a comment, but Jordan only offered a faint smile before walking inside without a word. That silence, at first a curiosity, soon became a tense anticipation because everyone knew he was not just any father, but a respected judge well versed in every legal process and fully aware of exactly when to deliver a decisive blow. Sometimes, late at night, Jordan sat alone at his desk, a thick stack of documents before him. He read every statute, every precedent, and similar past cases, noting points he could use. The desk lamp cast light over his face, highlighting patience and calculation. Jordan knew that if he acted too soon, he would be dismissed as an emotional father letting anger lead him. But if he waited until all the evidence, witnesses, and public sentiment aligned toward a single goal, his words would carry the weight of a public verdict that could not be ignored. Malik sensed that his father was preparing for something. He noticed him on the phone with friends in the legal field or reading the news and falling into long, thoughtful silences. Once, Malik quietly asked, "What will you do to him?" Jordan placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his gaze both warm and resolute. "When the time comes, you'll see." The answer was short, but enough for Malik to understand that his father's silence was not surrender, but preparation for a decisive moment. While Jordan waited, the wave demanding Kane's removal did not slow. Human rights groups organized campaigns to flood the sheriff's office with emails and phone calls, thousands pouring in each day. Some dispatch staff had to rotate shifts frequently from exhaustion. On social media, every time the police department posted anything, whether related or not, the comments filled with a single demand: fire Travis Kane. Protests outside headquarters grew larger, especially in the evenings after work hours. The sound of drums and chants mingled with the glow of hundreds of raised phone screens recording the crowd. They knew each frame would be shared again, amplifying the pressure, forcing those inside the building to feel they could not hide. Press began publishing deeper analyses of Jordan's role, even though he still had not spoken publicly. Some writers called it strategic silence, noting that a veteran judge like him would know how to make his words a fatal blow. These speculations only heightened public anticipation, creating an atmosphere like the moments before a major trial when everyone waits for the holder of the winning card to take the stand. As that moment drew closer, those closest to Jordan could see his focus sharpen. He reviewed every file related to the case, asked colleagues to gather more witness statements, especially from those who had filmed video, and discreetly reached out to certain media outlets, offering no official comment, but ensuring they understood the case would not end quietly. Outside public opinion swelled like a rising tide, waiting for a push to break every barrier. And Jordan, standing firm in the midst of that wave, kept his eyes forward, waiting for the exact moment to bring the truth into the light and force the man who had hurt his son to face consequences with no way out. That morning, the main hall of City Hall was packed. The front rows were filled with reporters from major news outlets, microphones fixed to the podium, cameras trained on the center stage. The air was thick with anticipation, a mix of hushed conversations and the constant clatter of typing. No one wanted to miss this moment because for weeks the name Jordan Pierce had been everywhere. Yet he had remained silent through the storm. Today that silence was about to end. The door opened and Jordan walked in with a steady stride. His gaze swept across the room, pausing for a moment on the cameras as if weighing every person before him. He placed a stack of documents on the podium, drew in a deep breath, and slowly unbuttoned his jacket. Camera shutters clicked in rapid succession as Jordan gently pulled his jacket aside, revealing the gleaming state judge's badge on his left chest. The room froze for several seconds, then erupted in gasps and a rush of questions. Some reporters immediately lunged for their phones to push out breaking news. Without a single word, that gesture explained everything. Jordan was not just a father fighting for his son, he was one of the most powerful figures in the state's judicial system. In that moment, his message was clearer than any speech. This was not a personal vendetta, it was a fight for justice at the highest level. Jordan raised his hand for silence, his voice steady but edged with steel. "I'm here, not as a judge, but first and foremost as a father. But make no mistake, I know exactly how the law will deal with a man who burned a child's hand in broad daylight." His eyes never wavered, locking on the cameras as if addressing Travis Kane directly. A few journalists whispered to one another, realizing this press conference had shifted from a simple statement to a public declaration of war. He briefly recounted the events from his family's perspective without embellishing emotion, yet enough for listeners to picture the pain Malik had endured. Murmurs rippled through the room when Jordan confirmed the family had been cooperating with investigators and was preparing the next legal steps. "I don't need anyone to pity my son," he said. "I need a system that can correct itself and remove those who use the badge to harm the innocent." Every word was broadcast live on television and across social media, racking up millions of views within minutes. Outside City Hall, the crowd watched on a giant screen in the square, cheering when they saw the judge's badge, clapping when he emphasized the word justice. Some had tears in their eyes as they realized that with Jordan's position and influence, this case could not be buried like so many others. When the speech ended, Jordan did not answer every question, leaving only one final line before stepping away from the podium. "Justice does not come from silence, but it requires patience to strike the target." Then he walked out, leaving behind a hall buzzing like a beehive that had just been shaken. Within an hour, the hashtag Judge Pierce hit the nationwide trending list, accompanied by images of him standing at the podium, the badge gleaming before the cameras. For millions, this marked the beginning of a new phase in the fight when a father who was also a judge officially stepped in to bring the man who hurt his son before the court. That statement rang in the press room like a hammer striking down the wall of silence Jordan had maintained for weeks. "I am the father of Malik Pierce, and I will defend justice for my son," was not merely an assertion of identity, it was a battle declaration, a public vow that this fight would not end as a fleeting wave of outrage. Reporters turned their microphones toward him, cameras zoomed in on every expression, capturing the determined gaze of a father and the authority of a judge. The sound of applause thundered, mixed with cheers from the square outside where hundreds were watching on a large screen. They supported him not just for his title, but because they saw in him a symbol of steadfast strength standing against injustice. Outside City Hall, the crowd swelled as if fed new fire. Signs bearing Malik's image were held higher chance of justice, for Malik bounced off every wall, mingling with horns and drums from activist groups. They knew the moment that had just happened would spread nationwide within hours, becoming the focus of every evening news broadcast. The heat of it did not only burn in the streets but seeped into homes and offices where people pulled out their phones to rewatch the speech. A few blocks away in his apartment, Travis Kane sat frozen before the television. The light from the live broadcast reflected on his face, highlighting the veins at his temples. When Jordan firmly spoke his son's name and declared his defense of justice, Kane's hand, holding a beer glass, trembled, the liquid spilling over the edge of the table. He had not expected that man to wield such influence, nor that his long silence had been preserved only to explode at the exact moment that left Kane in complete defensive retreat. On the screen, Jordan was shown leaving the podium surrounded by dozens of cameras following him while the scrolling caption read, "State Judge declares fight for justice for abused son." Kane swallowed hard, but his throat felt constricted. He knew from that moment on his every move would be scrutinized more than ever before. The image of the judge's badge, that powerful declaration, would cling to him, refusing to let him escape the public's watchful gaze. He stepped back, slumping into his chair, eyes still fixed on Jordan's image on the TV, his mind spinning frantically, calculating a way to survive. In another corner of the city, cafes, offices, and even classrooms paused so people could re-watch the speech. Strangers talked with each other about the composure and weight in Jordan's voice. Some veteran lawyers and judges remarked that he had skillfully placed himself both as a father and as part of the legal system, making anyone who wished to oppose him tread carefully. Meanwhile, social media exploded with a flood of posts, memes, and edited videos featuring the line, "I am the father of Malik Pierce," as a new rallying cry for the movement against police violence. International media began covering the story, calling it a turning point in the case. Some foreign newspapers compared it to pivotal moments in major American civil rights cases when a respected figure chose to stand up against the entire system. Searches for Jordan Pierce's name surged, followed by numerous articles on his career, his landmark rulings, and his contributions to the community. For Jordan, that moment was not a display of personal power, but a public commitment. As he stepped down from the podium, he knew he had placed his reputation and career into this fight. But Malik's eyes, as he rewatched the speech, eyes lit with renewed trust, made every risk worth it. The boy wrapped his arms tightly around his father without saying a word, yet that firm grip was enough for Jordan to understand that his son felt absolute protection. That evening, television channels replayed again and again the moment Jordan revealed his badge and vowed to defend justice. Each time the image appeared, crowds on the streets erupted in cheers as if drawing new strength to keep marching. For them, Jordan was not only a judge or a father, but a torchbearer leading the fight against abuse of power and owl laid bare before the public. Right after the explosive press conference, Jordan didn't let time slip away in the noise of public opinion. He spent the entire night with his team of aides reviewing files, noting every detail and timeline of the incident. The next morning, in front of the media and a small group of supporters, he officially filed a lawsuit against Travis Kane and the entire city police department. The complaint not only listed the act of child abuse against Malik, but also pointed to systemic failures from ignoring prior complaints to internal protection procedures that had effectively enabled the offender. Jordan's voice was low but firm as he left the courthouse. "This is not just my family's lawsuit. It's a warning to anyone who thinks power is a shield to do wrong." News of the lawsuit spread quickly, becoming the top headline in midday broadcasts. What fueled public excitement even further was Jordan's announcement of a special addition to his legal team, Naomi Fletcher, one of the nation's leading civil rights attorneys, known for spearheading landmark cases against police brutality and racial discrimination. Just hearing her name was enough for many reporters to understand this would be no half-hearted fight. She appeared beside Jordan, her gaze sharp as a blade, her voice ringing with force. "We're not just here to hold the perpetrator accountable, we're here to make sure no one else suffers the same pain." Naomi's arrival became a morale boost for those in the streets. Activist groups began began organizing online forums inviting legal experts to analyze the chances of winning and the case's potential impact on the system. National television devoted hours to dissecting every word in the complaint, highlighting how Jordan and Naomi had skillfully framed it within the broader context of long-standing injustice. At the law office, Naomi and Jordan worked relentlessly, turning every detail into irrefutable evidence. Videos from witnesses were preserved and submitted to the court, while images of Malik's bandaged hand were included in the file as direct proof of the harm caused. Naomi instructed her private investigative team to gather similar incidents involving Cain, building a behavioral pattern dossier to prove this was not an isolated mishap, but a systemic practice. Meanwhile, the police department began taking defensive measures. The spokesperson held a press conference attempting to downplay the matter by calling it an unfortunate misunderstanding and promising an internal investigation. But such words did nothing to calm public outrage, especially when people had seen firsthand what happened through the widely circulated videos. The hashtag #JusticeForMalik remained at the top of social media trends, now joined by #FletcherInTheFight, as a public declaration that this was a battle the people would watch to the very end. Jordan knew the legal road was never short, but he also knew that with persistence and public pressure, this case could not be shelved like the dozens of others that had vanished from public view. Malik still needed treatment for his burns, and each time Jordan saw his son's hand, his resolve burned hotter. He didn't just want to win the CAE, he wanted to set a precedent strong enough that any police officer would think twice before acting outside the law. As he signed the final pages before sending them off, Jordan looked up at Naomi. No words were needed. Both understood that from this moment the fight had entered its most decisive stage, where the law would be the weapon and the truth the final blow. The summons was delivered to Cain on a damp morning, gray clouds still hanging low in the sky. The pounding on the door startled him, and when he opened it, 2 court officers stood there, faces stern, handing him the subpoena. The bold letters cut into the pride Cain had carried for years like a blade. He tried to keep a calm facade in front of neighbors peeking through their curtains, but the tight grip on the paper betrayed a tension he couldn't hide. For the first time since the incident, he felt his power eroding by the day, by the hour, and no badge was big enough to shield him from justice. News of Cain's summons was quickly seized by the media. Headlines across papers emphasized the severity of the case and how a police officer once hailed as a model law enforcer now had to face the very system he thought would protect him. A court date was set, and until then, the public seemed glued to his every move. Clips of Cain hurrying into his house, dodging reporters' questions, spread endlessly online, accompanied by thousands of comments, mixing outrage with grim satisfaction. A few days later, at a special press conference, the district attorney stood at the wooden podium, the glare of cameras washing over her resolute face. Her voice rang clear without hesitation, announcing Cain would be prosecuted on 2 serious charges, child abuse and racial discrimination, in the course of duty. Each word was weighted, driving home to the public that this was not an isolated incident, but a betrayal of the very oath to protect the community that he had once spoken. The combination of these charges meant Cain could face an unprecedentedly severe sentence, a powerful message to the entire force that abuse of power would be punished to the fullest extent. Behind the district attorney, a large display board outlined the key evidence. Most prominently, the images of Malik's blistered hand, witness videos, and testimony from individuals who had accused Cain in the past. All were laid out in a coherent chain of proof tightening steadily around him. The sense of being cornered brought Cain's mind back to the moments he had once brazenly crossed the line without consequence, only to realize those days had now come to an end. Meanwhile, Jordan and Naomi watched the press conference from the law office. Their eyes met when they heard the district attorney emphasize racial discrimination because that was the core of the lawsuit and the key to pushing the issue beyond the scope scope of a single act of abuse. Jordan knew that once this element was proven, the verdict would not only punish Cain, but also pave the way for deep reforms in a system that had long tolerated such conduct. The news of the prosecution immediately reignited the community's outrage. New marches were organized with people carrying posters of Malik and the words, "Justice is coming." Human rights organizations sent letters thanking the district attorney for the courage to face political pressure and make the right decision. On television, legal experts commented that this case could become a historic milestone in the fight against police brutality and racial discrimination. Cain, inside his home, turned on the TV, only to switch it off when his image flooded every news broadcast. He sat in silence, looking around the room that had once felt like a place of absolute safety, now more like a cramped cage. His hand trembled, unsure whether from anger or fear, as he thought about the moment he would have to stand before the court face Jordan, the father he had underestimated, and endure hundreds of eyes tracking his every reaction. For the first time, Cain realized that the name Travis Cain would forever be tied to this case, not as a law enforcer, but as a symbol of abusive power laid bare and punished. The courtroom that day was packed, not a single seat left empty, with some people in the back standing against the wall, all eyes fixed on the wooden stand where Malik sat. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the small arm still wrapped in fresh white bandages, the gauze neat, but unable to hide the raised uneven burn marks beneath. Malik spoke slowly, each sentence broken by pauses to catch his breath, sometimes glancing at Jordan, finding steadiness in his father's gaze. He recounted the moment the officer approached, pressed him with questions about something that didn't exist, then suddenly grabbed his arm and pressed a blazing flame against his skin. Each detail landed like a knife into the already tense atmosphere, making several people in the room clench their fists or shake their heads in outrage. Across the room, Cain sat upright, hands clasped together on the table, his face carefully blank. When it was his turn, he rose his voice, calm to the point of coldness, claiming he had never intended to cause serious injury to Malik, only to lightly punish to deter suspicious behavior. His choice of words sent murmurs through the room, prompting the judge to bang the gavel for order. Cain pressed on, arguing that in the course of duty, he had the right to use control measures to ensure the area's safety. But with each word, he only widened the gap between himself and any shred of sympathy from the room. From the prosecution's table, Jordan's civil rights attorney rose to counter, pointing out that no regulation or statute permitted a police officer to use fire to deter a child, especially one holding nothing dangerous. The attorney presented a video from the scene where Cain was clearly smiling while gripping Malik's arm as the lighters of flame flared. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the footage played on a large screen. The blue glow of the flame reflected on Cain's satisfied face, in stark contrast to the boy's terrified expression and cries of pain. Malik lowered his head as the video replayed, his bandaged hands clasping together tightly. Sitting directly behind him, Jordan placed a steadying hand on his son's shoulder, a quiet but unshakable reassurance. That presence acted like a shield, keeping Malik from collapsing under the suffocating air of the trial. Some in the audience wiped tears, others shook their heads, and a few stared at Cain as if to silently ask whether this was the light punishment he had just defended. Cain began to lose his composure as the cross-examination intensified. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he tried to dodge the questions, claiming the camera angle didn't capture the full context, that the boy had shown a defiant attitude and might have been hiding something dangerous. But that argument unraveled when the prosecutor pointed out that Malik had been holding only a soda can, simply waiting for his father, showing no sign or behavior of any threat. As the witnesses' testimonies were read, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier. The woman who had recorded the initial video described in detail how Cain reacted when confronted, even going so far as to destroy her phone. A young man who had live-streamed the incident also took the stand to confirm that everything the online community had been outraged over had happened exactly as seen in the footage. These accounts stacked atop one another like layers of evidence, steadily breaking down Cain's wall of defense in full view of everyone present. The trial stretched late into the afternoon as the daylight outside took on a golden hue. Jordan remained silent, simply observing, allowing the evidence and testimony to speak for him. Yet, it was clear to anyone watching that his restraint was not weakness, but another form of strength, the kind that came from faith, that justice, this time, would not turn its back on the truth. The video began to play, the glow from the large screen spilling across the courtroom, casting cold shades of blue and yellow on every face. There were no coughs, no shifting of chairs, only a silence so deep the scratch of the court clerk's pencil could be heard. On screen, the moment unfolded with brutal clarity. Malik's small hand pinned firmly, the lighter's blue flame flickering just inches from his skin before being pressed against it. The faint click of the lighter, followed by its sudden flare, gave way to the heart-wrenching scream of a child, prompting some in the room to turn away, while others gripped their seat arms tightly. Frame by frame, Cain's expression of satisfaction appeared unmistakably, his lips curling upward like a man who believed himself in absolute control. Jordan sat in the plaintiff's row, his back straight, eyes locked on the screen. He didn't blink, as if determined to etch every detail into memory, so that nothing that happened to his son would ever fade. When the video ended, he turned his head, his gaze like a blade driving straight into Cain. It was a look that needed no words sharp enough to make Cain instinctively shrink back. Between them hung a space taut as steel wire, a silence no one dared to break. The prosecutor rose, voice cutting through the stillness, and asked Cain if he denied that this was an intentional act of causing injury to a child. Cain swallowed hard, glancing quickly toward his legal team as if for an anchor, then muttered that it was a situation that was misunderstood. Before he could finish, the prosecutor pointed to the screen to the image of Cain's face lit with smug satisfaction and asked, "And this smile, how do you explain that?" A flicker of unease crossed Cain's face as he turned away, unable to meet Jordan's eyes retreating from the confrontation. From the gallery, a few people shook their heads, whispers rippled briefly before the judge reminded everyone to remain orderly. Jordan stayed perfectly still, his eyes locked on Cain, not giving him a single second to look away. It was not only the gaze of a father defending his child, but also that of a judge well acquainted with truth and falsehood, capable of stripping away the thin shell of excuses from the other side. Cain lowered his head, lips pressed tight, his hand trembling slightly on the table, fingers curling in as if trying to shrink away from the invisible weight pressing down on him. Jordan's attorney seized the moment, requesting the video be replayed in slow motion. This time, every movement Cain made, every glance, every flick of the lighter was magnified, leaving no one in the room able to claim they had missed a detail. When the frame froze on the moment the flame neared Malik's skin, Jordan leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharpening even further, as if pinning Cain to the very instant of his guilt. The air grew thick, and everyone knew it was a moment where no argument could obscure the truth now laid bare. Cain tried to avoid meeting Jordan's gaze, but the man's presence was like a wall he could not pass. The onlookers could feel the tension radiating, not loud but powerful, like the charged stillness before a storm breaks. The prosecutor ended the presentation with a single clipped sentence, "No one has a right to do this to a child." The words dropped into the room heavy and final, prompting even those who had remained neutral to nod in agreement. Jordan said nothing, but the answer was already in his eyes. That unbroken stare held Cain in place, denying him the chance to turn away, as if to remind him that from this moment forward he would have to face the consequences of what he had done before the law and before the father he had most deeply wronged. The courtroom carried a different air that day. The back rows packed with people, many of them active or retired officers. Midway through the proceedings, when the prosecutor announced they would call a special witness, every eye turned toward the door. A man in a gray shirt, calm in demeanor but walking with the weight of something heavy, entered. He introduced himself as Samuel Brooks, a former officer who had served in the same unit as Kane for nearly 10 years. That brief introduction sparked a ripple of whispers in the room as several recognized him as someone who had once defended Kane in certain sensitive incidents. Brooks stood tall at the witness stand, eyes first on the judge, then shifting to the prosecutor. His voice was low but steady, each word clear. "I once called Travis Kane my partner, but today I stand here because I can no longer remain silent." The statement sliced through the quiet like a blade, a few officers in the back tilting their heads, their expressions a mix of surprise and doubt. Brooks began recounting incidents from their time working together, including occasions when Kane used excessive force on black teenagers' actions for which he was reprimanded, but that quickly vanished from record after internal reports were altered. He stressed that each time the system chose to protect the uniform instead of the truth. When asked about the severity, Brooks paused before stating he had once seen Kane press a flashlight into a boy's face, coercing a confession to something the boy had not done, a case that disappeared from official records within a week. The testimony sent a jolt through the courtroom, sharp intakes of breath echoing from the audience. At the defense table, Kane's face drained of color, his jaw set as if to hold back any reaction, but his hands on his knees clenched so tightly that the knuckles turned white. The prosecutor then presented a thick stack of files noting they were internal disciplinary records recently cleared for public release. As each page flashed on the large screen, the list of complaints against Kane became clear: unnecessary force, racially charged remarks, abuse of authority. Each case had a complainant, but the outcomes were always the same: insufficient evidence or resolved internally. Frustration rippled through the room, some shaking their heads, others murmuring in irritation. Brooks did not avoid Kane's gaze, and when asked why he was only speaking now, he admitted that for years he too had been part of that silence, something he regretted deeply. He said he had once believed that protecting a fellow officer was the highest principle, but seeing the image of Malik's burned hand circulate everywhere made him realize that silence only empowered those willing to harm others. At this, Jordan, seated at the plaintiff's table, gave a small nod, his eyes a mix of empathy and unwavering resolve. Kane now kept his head down, his expression unreadable, though a flash of anger crossed his eyes when Brooks ended his testimony with, "Travis, you betrayed your oath to protect the public, and today I choose to protect justice instead of protecting you." The judge acknowledged the testimony, the prosecutor thanked the witness, and the air in the courtroom grew heavier as everyone understood that what had just happened was not merely an accusation, but a betrayal from within the very ranks Kane had once believed to be his strongest shield. The jury sat in 2 rows, eyes fixed on the stack of disciplinary files just made public. Faces that had once held neutral expressions now bore stern looks. A few brows furrowed, some leaning back in their seats but with eyes sharp as blades. They had heard Brooks' candid account, had seen the documented complaints against Kane over the years, and now each detail seemed like a needle pressing deeper into their sense of justice. The outrage was silent but clear in every frown and exchanged glance, as if they all shared the same conclusion that what they were witnessing was a blatant betrayal of the duty to protect civilians. At the defense table, Kane tried to appear composed but couldn't hide the quick glances toward the jury box, where even the slightest shake of a juror's head made him feel everything slipping further from his control. Kane's defense attorney, Mr. Richards, known for his calm demeanor and extensive experience experience in police-related cases began to show signs of unease. When he rose to rebut, he gripped the folder so tightly that the papers rustled as if about to tear. His opening words faltered an unnecessary pause before he managed, "Your Honor, we must consider the full context." But what context could salvage the image of a police officer smiling as he pressed a lit lighter to a child's hand? Each time Richards tried to shift the narrative toward a deterrent measure or a method to control the situation, the prosecutor immediately cut in with concrete evidence, forcing Richards to step back, exhale sharply, and pivot to another point. He attempted to lean on Kane's character, noting his years of service and commendations in dangerous assignments. But as soon as he spoke, the prosecutor called for the video of Kane in a bar the very night Malik was injured, laughing and saying with disdain, "Just a black kid." The footage poured gasoline on the fire, and the courtroom's atmosphere instantly boiled over. Richards swallowed hard, his eyes flicking toward Kane as if blaming him for the reckless act that had just sabotaged the defense strategy. In the gallery, whispers spread quickly, some shaking their heads in disgust, others murmuring that this wasn't the first time they'd seen an attorney struggle so hard under a barrage of evidence. Richards returned to the table, flipping quickly through pages, searching for a new angle. But the more he spoke, the less confident his voice became. Every rebuttal was met with another piece of evidence, a testimony or a past record, making the portrait of Kane sharper and harder to deny. The jury didn't need to speak, their eyes were already a provisional verdict hanging over the defendant's head. Jordan sat across the room, his back straight, his eyes fixed firmly on Richards as if daring him to find any reasonable justification for harming his son. Malik sat beside his father, his hands still wrapped in white bandages, his face showing clear fatigue, but his eyes wide open, following every word and every image presented. Each time the prosecutor introduced a piece of incriminating evidence, Jordan would rest his hand lightly on his son's shoulder, a silent reassurance that justice was drawing closer. Richards glanced at Jordan several times, perhaps realizing that in this case he wasn't just up against a body of evidence, but also facing the image of a father who was a judge ready to wield every tool of the law to protect his child. When the court recessed, Richards leaned down to confer quickly with Kane. His face was taut with tension, their whispered exchange broken by pauses, Kane occasionally shaking his head or pressing his lips together. Some reporters aimed their cameras to capture the moment as it laid bare the fracture between attorney and client. Returning after the break, Richards tried to regain his composure, opening with, "We cannot let emotions override the truth," but the prosecutor immediately countered. "The truth here is that a child suffered severe burns because a police officer pressed a lighter to his hand. The emotions are merely the consequence of that truth." A low murmur of "That's right" rippled through the room, and a few jurors nodded slightly. The atmosphere now felt like a siege with Richards at the center, but every avenue blocked by evidence, testimony, and imagery. The more he maneuvered, the more his unease showed, tilting the jury further toward conviction. In the final minutes of the session, Richards was reduced to repeating a few weak points, avoiding direct eye contact with the jury box. When the bell signaling adjournment rang, he gathered his papers quickly, avoiding the gaze of the press and the public, leaving behind a courtroom steeped in a heavy air, where everyone could feel the scales of justice tipping decisively to one side. The presiding judge sat upright in the high-backed chair, his voice deep and steady as he read the final words of the verdict. The courtroom was silent, every gaze fixed on the wooden gavel in his hand. Kane stood at the front, his hands clenched tightly, his eyes fixed on the floor as if trying to avoid the gaze of anyone present. With irrefutable evidence, with testimony from witnesses and the victim, and with the severity of this case, the court sentences the defendant, Travis Kane, to 8 years in prison. The sound of the gavel striking echoed through the heavy air, ending whatever fragile hope Kane had been clinging to. The moment the sentence was spoken, the gallery erupted. The applause wasn't loud and chaotic, but firm and resolute, the sound of people who knew justice had been named. Some stood outright, their faces lit with a mix of satisfaction and emotion. Malik sat beside Jordan, his eyes wide as if to memorize every word that had just been spoken. He turned to his father, his gaze carrying both relief and trust. Jordan gave a small nod, his hand squeezing his son's shoulder, a silent confirmation that what they had endured had not been in vain. Kane lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot, a flicker of both anger and helplessness in his expression. He scanned the crowd and met familiar yet distant faces, former colleagues, members of the community, a few reporters who had hounded him during the trial. Every glance aimed at him was a silent judgment. The officer, who once swore to protect the public, now stood to be escorted away as a criminal. Two deputies stepped forward, placing their hands on his arm, signaling him to move. Kane took a deep breath, but his steps were heavy, the cold rattle of metal chains marking each movement. At the prosecution's table, the legal team exchanged looks of quiet satisfaction. One human rights attorney, who had stood by Jordan since the very beginning, allowed herself a small smile at seeing the sentence match the gravity of the crime. Across from them, Richards quietly packed his papers without a word. He knew every attempt at a defense had been drowned beneath the tide of evidence and public pressure. Jordan didn't look toward Richards or Kane. His eyes were fixed only on Malik. For him, this moment was not just a legal victory, but a promise to his son that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, would find its way to the surface. As the applause continued, some people raised their phones to capture Kane being led away. Those clips were uploaded to social media almost immediately, drawing tens of thousands of shares. The image of the officer who had once grinned as he hurt a child, now shuffling under the furious gaze of the community, became a symbol of a rare but powerful reversal of power. Malik watched, not with gloating, but with the eyes of a child who had just learned that justice does not always come easily, but when it does, it changes everything. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had already gathered. When the doors opened and Jordan stepped out with his son, cheers rose like a wave. Signs reading "Justice for Malik" were held high, mingling with chants against police brutality and racial discrimination. Jordan walked slowly, holding his son's hand so Malik could see and feel the strength of community solidarity. A reporter called out, "How do you feel about this verdict?" Jordan paused, looked at Malik, then replied, "This is not just my son's victory, but a victory for everyone who believes no one is above the law." His words set off another eruption from the crowd, applause mixing with chants of Malik's name. In a far corner, a group of black children stood beside their parents, watching Malik with admiration. The boy smiled faintly, as if he understood he had just become part of a story bigger than himself. Jordan looked at his son, his eyes a mix of pride and concern, knowing the fight against prejudice was never a short one. But for today at least, they had won an important battle. Behind them, Kane was loaded into a prison transport van. He glanced back one last time, but the final image he saw wasn't the courthouse or the reporters. It was the backs of Jordan and Malik in the middle of a sea of people, a symbol of what he had tried to deny, the strength of justice and a father's love. The van's door slammed shut. The engine roared to life, and it carried him away from the place where his steps had once sown pain, now leaving behind a different mark, the mark of reckoning. The air outside remained electric, but within each person present was a shared feeling, determination, unity, and the belief that a just society was not out of reach. Jordan squeezed his son's hand. Malik lifted his head, and together they walked away from the noise toward a future they believed could be different. Kane kept his head bowed, his shoulders heavy, as if the entire courtroom had been placed on them, the clink of chains at his wrists echoing in dry, steady beats with the heavy steps of the deputies escorting him. He didn't dare raise his face, for every gaze around him was a blade of contempt and anger. the same people he had once thought of as those under his protection. As he passed the gallery, Kane clearly heard the whispers of hatred, the mocking whistles, each one carving deeper into his mind that there was no way back. Jordan sat in the front, his eyes following Kane's every step without a word, without any show of triumph, just the quiet of a man who had closed the chapter on a long era of injustice. Malik sat close beside him, his small hand gripping his father's, his eyes no longer filled with the fear of the first day, but with relief and the innocent belief of a child who had learned that what is right can in the end prevail. As Kane disappeared behind the door leading to the holding cells, the atmosphere in the courtroom slowly eased. Jordan bent down, wrapping his arms around his son, his embrace a shield encircling the small body. Malik leaned against his father's shoulder, his breathing steadying, a sense of safety returning after months haunted by the scars on his hand. Jordan spoke softly, his voice deep and steady, as if both reassuring his son and reaffirming a promise fulfilled. We won. Those words were not only for Malik, but for himself, for everyone who had stood with them through this battle, and for the community still watching beyond those doors. Malik looked up, his eyes shimmering in the faint light from the window, a small smile forming as if finally understanding why his father had been so steadfast. Voices calling to one another echoed from the hallway, a few reporters preparing to meet Jordan and Malik as they left the courthouse. But in this moment, all the sounds outside faded from the minds of father and son. Jordan gently ran his hand through Malik's hair, feeling the warmth and heartbeat of the boy, a reminder that the only reason he had endured all of this was not to prove his own strength, but to protect Malik's peace. Farther away, some members of the community quietly left the gallery, their faces lighter but still carrying the weariness of those who knew this was only one victory, not the end of a long fight. Jordan watched them go, fully aware they would keep fighting for the other Maliks, still out there, for the other Kanes, still lurking somewhere in the shadows of power. He rose, taking his son's hand, and together they walked slowly out of the courtroom. The sound of their shoes on the tiled floors was no longer hurried or tense, but the steps of people who had reclaimed the justice owed to them. Malik glanced back at the room where everything had unfolded. In his eyes, it no longer seemed as frightening as it had the first day he entered, but now stood as proof that truth could be heard and protected. Jordan gave his son's hand another gentle squeeze before pushing open the heavy wooden door, letting the light from outside flood in, carrying the cheers of the crowd that had been waiting. In that moment, he knew this victory would stay with them forever, not only as a memory, but as a reminder that the strength of a father's love and faith in justice could overcome any wound. The next morning, a press release from the police department was issued opening with the line no one ever expected to see from the agency Comprehensive Force Reform Plan. The city seemed to pause for a few beats to read it, the words spreading quickly across news sites and social media, gathering hundreds of thousands of shares within hours. The plan listed a series of changes from mandatory retraining on human rights and the removal of bias-driven courses to strict oversight of each officer's conduct. An anonymous reporting system was established to encourage whistleblowing, ensuring that cases like Kane's would no longer have the chance to be buried. When Jordan read the statement, he simply nodded, knowing this was the inevitable outcome when the truth had nowhere left to hide. At the press conference announcing the plan, the atmosphere in the hall was taut as a drawn wire. In the front row sat high-ranking department officials, faces once firm and confident, now lowered their eyes, avoiding the cameras. When reporters pressed for questions about personal accountability, several names were called out and more than a few appeared unable to withstand the pressure. Within 2 days, 3 key leaders, including a deputy director and 2 district commanders, had resigned. Their departures were not only the result of public outcry, but also proof that the old structure had been shaken to its core. Outside the police department, "Justice for Malik" signs still waved in the air, but the chants now carried a different tone from weeks before. No longer the heavy, desperate anger, but the steadiness of those who had begun to see the results of collective effort. Human rights organizations immediately organized forums, inviting lawyers, scholars, and former officers to dissect the reform plan, pointing out strengths, weaknesses, and ways to ensure it would not be abandoned halfway. Jordan received an invitation to attend as an honored guest, and he knew this was a moment when his voice would reach far beyond the courtroom. Malik sat beside his father as Jordan reviewed his speech, tilt in his head to ask why so many people cared about what had happened to him. Jordan set down his pen, looking at his son for a long moment, before answering that it was because his story had touched both the pain and the hope of countless people. And if a 10-year-old dared to face injustice, adults could not pretend not to see. Malik nodded, as if understanding that the burn on his hand had become a symbol forcing an entire system to change. When Jordan stepped up to the podium at the forum, the room fell completely sullen. He spoke little about personal pain, instead focusing on what needed to be done to prevent similar events from ever happening again. He emphasized that reform was not just about changes on paper, but a living commitment sustained and monitored by the whole community. Each of his words was met with long applause, not because he was a judge, but because he was a father who had fought to the very end to protect his son and turn a personal story into a catalyst for collective change. On television, images of the three leaders leaving their posts were broadcast, the cardboard boxes of personal belongings in their hands, marking a definitive end to the old era. Commentators described it as one of the most sweeping reforms in the city's history. Meanwhile, younger officers expressed relief knowing they now had the chance to work in a more transparent environment, one where abuses of power would be dealt with immediately instead of being hidden away. The shockwaves from the reform plan did not stop at the city's borders. Neighboring states began reviewing their own internal procedures, with some even sending delegations to study the new model. Major newspapers ran headlines like "From Tragedy to Reform," the story of Malik Pierce. The entire nation watched, and somewhere children who had once felt fear at the sight of a uniform began to believe that justice was not a distant concept. When Jordan saw his son smiling more brightly each day, he knew that every exhausting and stressful step they had taken had been worth it. As the afternoon settled in, he took Malik to the riverside where they used to walk before. The cool breeze carried the scent of water and the distant sound of birds, a piece they had thought was lost for many months. Malik ran ahead a few steps, the bandage on his hand now removed, revealing a pale red but resilient scar. Jordan watched him, smiling, with the thought etched deeply in his mind that the scar was not only a mark of pain, but also a reminder that every major change begins with a personal story told at the right time in the right way, and no one can stop it from spreading. Immediately after the reform plan was approved, anti-bias training was rolled out across the entire force. No longer brief, perfunctory meetings. This program was carefully designed to last several weeks with the participation of sociologists, psychologists, and legal experts. Officers, from rookies to veteran commanders, were required to attend without exception. In the classrooms, hypothetical scenarios were presented, forcing participants to confront their own unconscious biases from their gaze and gestures to the way they asked questions. Some initially showed discomfort, but under public pressure and the threat of removal from the force if they failed to complete the course, they had no choice but to listen and change. Instructors stressed that this was not just a mandatory requirement, but a vital commitment if the department wanted to regain the community's lost trust. Alongside the training, a new wave began as many old cases were reopened. Files once buried deep in cabinets were now brought out for review, and allegations from years past began surfacing in the press. Some retired officers were called back to answer questions, and a few even faced the possibility of prosecution. The media continuously published lists of cases that had been ignored, ranging from excessive force during arrests to openly discriminatory incidents that had been covered up. Each news broadcast stirred public outrage, while also encouraging past victims to step forward and tell their stories. At a community meeting, Jordan sat quietly in the back row watching people who for the first time dared to take the microphone and speak about their painful experiences. An elderly woman, her voice trembling, recounted how her son had been beaten simply for not carrying identification, while a young man spoke of being searched without cause on his way to school. Each story was like a drill piercing through the shell of silence that had shielded the police force for decades. Malik sat beside his father, his eyes wide, seeming to understand that what had happened to him was only part of a much larger picture of injustice. The Internal Affairs Division now worked tirelessly with special task forces formed to review every old complaint. Public pressure forced them into complete transparency, with all investigation results posted on the public portal for anyone to follow. More than a few officers still in active service were suddenly suspended, pending investigation, sending a clear message. No one stood outside the reach of accountability. Human rights activists saw this as a golden opportunity to push for deeper reform. They collaborated with law schools to host workshops on civil rights, inviting even high school students to learn how to protect themselves and understand their rights. Jordan was invited as a speaker for an online forum where he shared that anti-bias training and revisiting old cases were not only about punishment, but more importantly about preventing the cycle of injustice from continuing. Meanwhile, those who had once defended Cain or claimed that Malik's case was exaggerated began to fall silent. Evidence, testimony, and investigation results made every line of defense seem flimsy. Major newspapers remarked that the city was undergoing an unprecedented period of cleansing, and if the momentum could be maintained, it could become a national model for handling a crisis of trust in law enforcement. Jordan viewed the entire scene with cautious resolve. He understood that these steps forward were significant, but without sustained community oversight, everything could revert to the old ways. He continued attending meetings, contributing to the reform process, and refused to let his guard down. Malik returned to school, his hand healed, but the red scar still visible, an indelible mark. Sometimes he would hold it up and stare at it for a long time, then ask his father whether one day people might forget. Jordan smiled gently and said there would always be someone who remembered as long as they kept telling the story and did not let it be buried like the old cases now brought back into the light. The combination of anti-bias training and addressing past, overlooked incidents created a sense that justice was truly in motion, no longer just an empty promise. Though the road ahead remained long, each step strengthened the belief that what Malik and his family had endured would not be in vain. Jordan sat before the television camera, the studio lights casting a determined glow across his face, his eyes still carrying the weariness of months spent in an unrelenting fight. The host opened with a brief introduction, then invited him to share the full story. But Jordan did not begin with his own. Instead, he spoke of other children, those without a judge for a father to protect them, without the media to bear witness, who had endured harm no one knew about. He said, justice should not only be a gavel striking down in a courtroom, but a barrier that shields, preventing any hand of power from reaching out to harm a person's safety and dignity. When the host asked about Malik, Jordan exhaled softly, his eyes gentling, and said his son had been braver than he had imagined, and that Malik's strength had forced him to see the fight through to the end. The moment that left the audience utterly silent came when Jordan looked directly into the camera and declared, "Power is for protecting, not for burning." He was not only referring to the flame from the lighter that had burned his son's hand, but also to the hidden fire and prejudice in contempt and in the violence of those who hold authority. He explained that if power is given to a person without responsibility and compassion, it becomes a weapon of destruction capable of scorching the future of an entire generation. His words carried not the tone of sudden anger, but the firmness of a man who had witnessed and judged hundreds of cases, though this time the case had reached into his own heart. The interview ended to prolonged applause from the studio audience, and as soon as the program aired, his words spread rapidly across social media. The hashtag carrying his message quickly trended not just locally, but nationwide. Many online users wrote that they had heard countless speeches about justice, but rarely any as simple and piercing as his. In schools, teachers began quoting his words when teaching about civil rights, and human rights advocates incorporated them into policy campaigns. Jordan returned home late that night, sitting at the kitchen table with Malik. The boy asked why he had said that line in front of millions, and Jordan smiled, telling him it was something he wanted people to remember even longer than the case itself. Malik nodded, then suddenly asked, "So can I use my power to protect others?" The question made Jordan pause for a few seconds before placing a hand on his son's shoulder, telling him that a person's power doesn't have to come from a position or fame, but sometimes from the courage to speak the truth, to stand on the right side, and to not turn away when injustice is in sight. That night's conversation became one of the moments Jordan cherished most because it marked Malik's first step toward maturity after the ordeal. The boy no longer saw his story as just a wound, but began to see it as a reason to stand up. Jordan knew that beyond winning in court, the greater victory was helping his son believe in the power of justice and use it to protect others. To him, that was the truest victory. Malik sat beside his father, the corners of his mouth curling into a smile that was equal parts pride and relief. The light from the camera screen cast at an angle across his face, highlighting the depth of his dark eyes that had weathered so many storms, yet now held a new glimmer of hope. He was no longer the trembling boy from that sweltering afternoon when his hand had been pressed close to a flame, but now a living witness to the truth, a symbol that made millions feel they were not alone in the fight against injustice. Jordan looked at his son with a gentleness unlike any other moment, as if every word he had just spoken on television had been meant for Malik as well. They didn't need to exchange many words. One smile and a nod were enough to know that the hardest part of their journey was behind them. Within hours of the broadcast, clips from the program were cut and shared across social media platforms. People didn't just repost Jordan's entire interview, they paired images of him and Malik sitting side by side with the now famous line, "Power is for protecting, not for burning." A short clip capturing Malik's smile next to his father was shared so widely that it appeared on trending video charts, surpassing even the day's biggest entertainment news. Each time the clip replayed, viewers didn't just see the boy's smile. They felt the weight of the journey behind it, one marked by blood, tears, and unyielding resolve. The comments under the clip overflowed with messages of support and gratitude. Many parents admitted they had cried upon seeing the image of father and son sitting together because it reminded them of the safety their own children deserve. Some independent journalists called it the smile of justice and insisted the image would be remembered for years to come. Human rights organizations quickly seized on the media momentum, attaching Jordan's message to advocacy campaigns and bringing Malik's story to even wider audiences, both at home and abroad. Cable TV, print newspapers, and podcasts all devoted airtime to analyzing why that moment had struck such a powerful chord. A sociologist noted that it was not only the story of a boy being protected, but proof that a community could unite to change an entire system. Many said they felt a spark of light in an era when so many injustices fade from memory far too quickly. Jordan and Malik sitting together, smiling after everything stood as proof that the struggle is not always in vain and that some battles do end with victory for what is right. International news outlets began reaching out to invite Jordan to speak, but he declined most offers, accepting only those he believed would keep the focus on the story's core value. He didn't want it to become a media spectacle spectacle, but rather a constant reminder of the original purpose to protect children, to protect the vulnerable from abuse of power. Malik was also asked several times if he wanted to speak out, but the boy simply smiled and said his father had already spoken enough for them both. The clip's reach quickly spread beyond the realm of legal matters. In schools, teachers began showing it during civics lessons to spark discussions about human rights, fairness, and the responsibilities that come with power. Some community groups organized forums inspired by the story, inviting people who had been victims of systemic violence to share their experiences and explore ways to support one another. On online forums, people spoke of Cain not only as the convicted abuser, but also of Malik as a new symbol of resilience, a boy who endured pain yet could still sit and smile before the world. In their home, Jordan and Malik carried on with their daily lives, though there was no denying that changes had taken place. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers sent letters, flowers, and gifts as gestures of solidarity. Malik read each letter, many from children far away, recounting times they had been bullied or treated unfairly, and how Malik's story had given them the courage to speak up. Jordan kept them all in a large wooden box, saying that one day when Malik was grown, he would read them again and understand that he had touched the hearts of many. In the evening, the clip hit a record number of shares. Jordan and Malik sat quietly on the couch watching it once more. Each frame felt like a slice of memory, from Jordan's gaze as he spoke about justice to Malik's smile as he sat beside his father. Malik rested his head on his shoulder and asked if everything was truly over. Jordan gently replied that it was only just beginning, because from now on they would not be fighting only for themselves, but for everyone who had been hurt and left unprotected. The boy was silent for a moment, then smiled again, a smile just like the one in the studio, but this time carrying an added resolve. Outside, the clip kept circulating, kept being discussed and analyzed, becoming part of a collective memory. It was not only proof of a legal victory, but also a reminder that in a turbulent world, even a smile can become the strongest voice of all. Jordan began receiving a wave of invitations from children's rights organizations across the country. They wanted him to share his and Malik's story, not just as a legal victory, but as a living message that parents can stand up to protect their children from injustice. Each time he stepped up to the podium, Jordan took a moment to look around the room, seeing faces listening intently, from veteran activists to ordinary parents. He recounted the day Malik was attacked by Cain without embellishment or softening, so people would understand that what might seem like headlines on the news could happen to any family. He emphasized that power in any form, if left unchecked, could become the most brutal weapon against the vulnerable. Applause followed every speech, but what moved him most was when parents came forward, shook his hand, and told him that because of his story they had found the courage to protect their own children. Soon after, families who had gone through similar ordeals began seeking him out, many carrying case files, ignored or rejected complaint letters, and sometimes scars, both physical and emotional, left on their children. Jordan listened to them all, never rushing to make promises, but always offering practical advice on legal approaches, evidence gathering, and how to seek community support. Some families admitted they were exhausted and ready to give up, but after meeting him, they felt they could try one more time. Malik witnessed these conversations, realizing that what his father was doing was not only about reclaiming justice for their family, but also opening a path for other families to find their own voice. Gradually, Jordan's talks expanded beyond Malik's case, encompassing broader issues of children's rights and the abuse of power by law enforcement. He used his own story to illustrate the gaps in the system, place where the law was either too weak or not enforced fairly. At a meeting meeting in the city hall when a mother stood up to ask if she should sue the local police for holding her son overnight without cause, Jordan didn't answer immediately. He looked her in the eyes and said that such a decision must be made with thorough preparation and steadfast resolve because the road to justice has never been easy. Jordan and Malik's story began to inspire community action groups. In many neighborhoods, people started organizing open discussions on how to respond when children are treated unfairly, how to legally document evidence, and how to coordinate pressure on authorities. Jordan was often invited as a special guest, sometimes only appearing online but still receiving a warm welcome. He realized that even though Cain's case was over, its impact was still rippling outward like waves extending farther and farther, touching people he and Malik might never meet in person. Malik, though still young, began joining his father at certain events, especially those focused on children. He rarely spoke much, but his presence was a vivid reminder that children are not only witnesses or victims, but can also become symbols of change. Once, when another boy asked if he was still afraid of the police, Malik stayed silent for a moment before saying he was still cautious, but now he knew he was not alone. That answer left the adults in the room quiet, for it carried a simple yet profound truth. Trust must be rebuilt, and it cannot rely solely on the promises of those in power. From a painful incident, the story had become a catalyst, connecting people who shared the same concern. Jordan understood that while he could not protect every child, he could help create an environment where violence and discrimination would have a much harder time hiding. Every thank you letter, every conversation, and every grateful glance he received was proof that this journey, though challenging, was worth continuing. And when he looked back, he knew his strength came not only from his title as a judge, but from being a father willing to turn his son's pain into a guiding light for an entire community. The Stop Police Abuse campaign launched at the start of summer, aiming to raise awareness about abuses of power and push for deep reform in the law enforcement. When the organizers invited Malik to be the face of the campaign, he hesitated at first, but after hearing Jordan explain that it was not just about retelling their family's story, but also protecting many other children, Malik nodded in agreement. His image with the hand once burned, now healed, but still bearing a faint scar, appeared on posters, banners, and promotional videos. In the public eye, Malik was no longer just a victim, but a living symbol of strength in overcoming pain and striving for justice. At events, he often stood beside his father, sometimes smiling at those who came to shake hands, sometimes quietly listening to others' stories. But his presence alone made the campaign's message more powerful. The media quickly spread those images, making Malik a familiar face, especially in discussions on police reform and child protection. Meanwhile, in a completely different place, the name Cain was being mentioned with the opposite meaning. In state prison, his story became a cautionary tale for both inmates and those working in the justice system. Many guards and new prisoners had heard the case retold and whispered accounts that an officer who once laughed while burning a child's hand ultimately had to bow before the court and serve a long sentence. Cain could not escape the scorn of those around him, with many seeing him as a prime example of the consequences of arrogance and abuse of power. Some inmates even mocked him with the nickname Burn Badge, recalling the image of the blazing lighter from the clip that once went viral. Rumors about Cain's isolation in prison spread beyond the walls, turning his story into a stark reminder for the public that no matter how much power one once held, when the boundaries of dignity and the law are crossed, the price will come sometimes heavier than expected. News articles, investigative programs, and social discussions occasionally reference Cain as part of the broader process of change. When Jordan was once asked in an interview whether he felt satisfied seeing Cain live like that, he simply replied that what mattered was not personal revenge, but ensuring the system was strong enough to prevent anyone else from repeating such actions. Malik's involvement in the campaign and Cain's role as a cautionary example created a sharp contrast, like two sides of the same coin. One side was a positive message, forward-looking, sparking hope and collective effort. The other was a clear illustration of the consequences of wrongdoing, a warning that could not be ignored. Many teachers, community organizers, and nonprofit groups use this story in training sessions, especially when speaking to young people about the importance of law, human rights, and social responsibility. Over time, the Stop Police Abuse campaign went beyond raising awareness, beginning to raise funds to support lawsuits against police violence. Malik, though still young, appeared in several fundraising videos, delivering short but moving statements. Each time, the image of his raised hand, part greeting, part proof, returned to the screen, evoking the moment that had changed his life forever. It kept the public from forgetting and ensured the campaign's message retained its weight. For the community, the parallel presence of the two stories, one of a victim turned symbol, one of an offender serving his sentence, was like a mirror reflecting two completely different paths a single act could lead to. It stirred not only outrage or empathy, but also forced people to think about how they themselves would act if placed in a position of power. And it was precisely this contrast that allowed the story of Malik and Cain to remain alive in the public mind as a chapter that was both a warning and an inspiration for real change. The passage of the new law bearing Malik's name took place during a live broadcast legislative session, drawing the attention of millions. After months of debate and hearings, state legislators voted almost unanimously to approve a statute that strictly punishes any act of police violence against children. The law clearly outlines harsher penalties, mandates the use of body cameras during all duties involving minors, and establishes an independent oversight committee to handle complaints. When the State House Speaker struck the gavel, announcing its passage, the chamber erupted in applause, not only from supporters but also from those who had once doubted change was possible. Jordan and Malik sat in the front row, quietly, taking in the moment, their eyes filled with both pride and relief, as if a new door had opened to protect other children from what Malik had endured. News of the law quickly spread nationwide, sparking a wave of discussion across media outlets. Many political analysts called it a major step forward in the fight against police abuse, especially since it was named after a child turning personal pain into a force for systemic change. The event also drew interest from other states. Within weeks, at least 5 states announced plans to introduce similar bills directly inspired by Malik's story. Children's rights advocacy groups, which had been following the case from the beginning, immediately organized conferences and distributed detailed guidance on how to adopt this model law, ensuring it could be replicated without losing its effectiveness. The strong response from other states showed that Malik's story was not just an isolated case, but a catalyst for change on a larger scale. In each state, new hearings opened where other victims and their families came forward to share what they had endured. Many referenced Malik as a symbol of resilience, affirming that if a child could inspire an entire state to change its laws, anyone could help push justice forward. Jordan, despite his busy role as a judge, made time to attend online meetings to share insights and encourage those fighting for their own versions of the law. The influence of the statute reached beyond the legal sphere. Schools began incorporating lessons on children's rights and the limits of law enforcement power into their curricula. These discussions, sometimes held as extracurricular activities, helped students understand that power must always be paired with responsibility, and no one is allowed to use it to harm the vulnerable. Many teachers noted that students were especially engaged when learning about Malik's story, finding it both relatable and deeply moving, a reminder of why speaking up against injustice matters. At the national level, human rights organizations and federal legislators also began studying the possibility of implementing a similar law nationwide. Though debates continued over jurisdiction and scope, this development proved that a case once thought to have only local impact could ignite far-reaching reforms. For Malik's family, it was clear proof that the grueling journey they had endured was not in vain. The scar on the boy's hand remained, but it was no longer just a reminder of pain. It had become a symbol of real change written into law. When autumn came, Jordan accepted an invitation to speak at the signing ceremony for the Malik law in another state. Standing at the podium, he looked out over hundreds of attendees, including children seated in the front row, and said that justice was not a distant concept, but began with each person's willingness to stand up when they saw wrongdoing. Malik, standing beside his father, gripped his hand tightly, his eyes reflecting the confidence of someone who knew his story, had already helped, and would continue to help many others. In that moment, they were no longer victim and witness. They had become contributors to a new chapter in the book of justice. The term Malik effect began appearing frequently in headlines from local newspapers to respected political journals, and quickly became a familiar concept in panel discussions, television programs, and social forums. The media used it to describe the chain reaction a single personal story could trigger when something seemingly small could ignite a movement for legal and societal change. Reporters noted that it was the image of Malik's bandaged hand alongside his father's resolve that had stirred not just outrage but sustained public interest, forcing lawmakers to act. Editorials emphasized that this was not simply a legal victory, but living proof of the power of the citizen's voice when it is persistent and not forgotten. Meanwhile, Jordan continued to receive invitations to honor events from statewide legal conferences, to award ceremonies hosted by international human rights organizations. Wherever he appeared, he was given the respect due to someone who had transformed personal pain into a force for systemic reform. When accepting the Torch of Justice Award from the American Bar Association, Jordan spoke little about himself, dedicating most of his speech to his son and the families who had stood alongside them throughout the fight. He said that if a judge only sat behind the bench, it was not enough. One had to step down, join the people, listen to them, and protect them. The image of Jordan holding Malik tightly on stage as the audience rose in applause was shared millions of times on social media. Many commented that the moment perfectly captured the meaning of justice, not just dry provisions in the law, but the preservation of human safety and dignity. Television networks invited Jordan as a special guest not only to recount the case, but also to discuss deeper reforms, from independent oversight mechanisms to retraining law enforcement. The recognition for Jordan also extended into education when a law school decided to include his and Malik's story in its curriculum as a case study. Students were encouraged to analyze both the legal and social aspects, from evidence gathering and public advocacy to policy impact. Many professors believed that learning from a real-life story, complete with emotional depth and political context, would help students better understand the role of law in everyday life. Back home, the local government organized a special ceremony to honor Jordan and his family. Residents, from those who had witnessed the incident firsthand to those who only knew about it through the news, came to attend. On stage, the mayor presented Jordan with the city's honorary certificate, calling him the man who reminded us that justice does not exist on its own. It must be protected every day. Malik sat in the front row, his face bright with pride, knowing that what he had endured had sparked a change even adults admired. From then on, the Malik effect was no longer tied only to a law or a courtroom, but became an inspiring story for anyone facing injustice. Jordan, though humble, understood that this recognition was not his alone, but belonged to all those who had refused to give up. And in the flash of cameras, the applause, and the grateful handshakes, he knew that he and his son had left an indelible mark on the long journey of justice. Malik stood in front of the class, his hands still held slightly close together, a habit formed after the day of the incident. The room was silent, with no laughter or distraction, as in typical homeroom periods, because everyone knew today Malik would talk about what had changed his life forever. His voice began slowly, as if searching for a path through a forest of heavy memories. Then each word grew clearer. Malik told them that afternoon had been so hot, it felt as if the ground itself might burn, and he had only been thinking about the cold drink in his hand while waiting for his father outside a convenience store. But everything changed when a large figure stepped toward him, bent down and locked an unfamiliar, scrutinizing gaze on him. Malik described the moment he heard the click of a lighter, saw the flame flare close to his skin, and felt a searing pain run through his hand like a toxic current. He paused, took a deep breath, looked at his classmates, and said that the feeling wasn't only on his skin, but deep in his heart, the fear of being treated as someone who deserved punishment just because of his skin color. A few girls in the class covered their mouths, some turned away as Malik went on to describe Kane's mocking laugh and the way he gripped his wrist tightly. Malik didn't embellish, but each detail was so precise that it made the whole classroom relive that moment. He spoke of seeing his father running toward him from a distance, but still blocked by a body in between, and of the mixed rush of hope and helplessness. Malik said the fear then was not only of physical pain, but of the possibility that no one would believe him or that everyone would dismiss it as something small. Then he smiled faintly, remembering the look in his father's eyes toward the man who had hurt his son, a look that promised he would not have to fight alone. Malik's voice lowered when he spoke of the nights afterward, his hand wrapped in white bandages, making even holding a pen a challenge. There were moments he woke in the middle of the night sure he could still smell burnt skin and hear the lighters flick somewhere near. Malik said that at first he pulled away when anyone touched his hand, even loved ones, because the memories came back too vividly. But over time, with long talks with his father and mother and the care of friends, he learned not to let fear control him anymore. Malik said his father often reminded him that true strength isn't about not being afraid, but about moving forward despite still feeling fear. When Malik moved on to the time the incident spread all over social media, some boys at the back of the class nodded slightly, perhaps remembering the images they had seen on their phones. Malik said that at first he didn't understand why people paid so much attention to him, only feeling uneasy when recognized everywhere. But gradually, he realized that telling his story was a way for other children who might be going through something similar to know they weren't alone. He didn't want his image to be tied forever to pain, but wanted people to remember that he had stood up and that victory was not only in the courtroom, but in reclaiming his life. In the classroom, the teacher stood silently in the corner, eyes filled with both pride and sorrow. Malik said that on his first day back at school, he had been nervous, thinking everyone would look at his hand first, but was surprised when a friend simply handed him a new pen and asked about yesterday's homework. That small gesture made Malik realize the world wasn't only made up of scrutinizing eyes, that there were still people who saw him simply as Malik, not a victim, not a symbol, just an ordinary boy. At the end of his story, Malik spoke about the fear he had overcome. He said the scar on his hand was still there, and every time he looked in the mirror he saw it as a reminder. But now it was no longer a symbol of helplessness. To him, the scar was proof that even after being burned, that hand could still hold on to hope, still write, draw, and embrace the people he loved. He lifted his head, looked around the class, and said, "If someone makes you afraid, remember that fear can be beaten, and when you overcome it, you'll be stronger than you were before." The whole class stood and applauded, not loudly, but for a long time, as if to let Malik know his story had reached each of them. The teacher stepped forward, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said that what he had just shared was not only a personal memory, but also a lesson in courage. Malik smiled, his eyes reflecting relief because he knew he had turned a painful memory into strength not only for himself, but for everyone listening. When Malik finished his story, the room still held a special kind of silence, not awkward, but full of empathy and respect. A student in the front row, known for rarely showing emotion, stood and walked over to Malik, wrapping him in a tight hug. That unexpected embrace spread like wildfire, with others stepping forward one by one. No one spoke much, but their eyes, hands on his shoulder, and gentle squeezes sent a clear message. They saw Malik as a role model, not flawless mirror without cracks, but one reflecting the will to survive, the courage to rise, and the ability to stand again after a storm. Malik was slightly taken aback, his eyes blinking quickly as if to hold back tears. Then he smiled, a warm, light smile, because he understood that he was not only being heard, but also seen for the person he wanted to be. Hug after hug followed until the class formed a circle around Malik. One classmate whispered in his ear that they had once been afraid when bullied, but seeing Malik today made them believe they could face their fear too. Another took his hand, fingers brushing the scar, and said it didn't make him weaker, it made his story more real, more powerful. Malik nodded, returning the gesture with a grateful look. In that moment, he felt the true weight of being a role model, not because someone told him he was a symbol, but because he had truly been through something terrible and still held on to his faith in what is good. Jordan stood silently at the back of the classroom, arms folded across his chest, watching every gesture, every look directed at his son. He didn't step into the circle, didn't say a word, and only kept his eyes on Malik. In that gaze was a quiet pride, the kind that needed no display but ran so deep it was hard to describe. Jordan remembered when this boy was only 10 years old, his hand bright red, his eyes drowning in panic. He remembered the nights his son tossed and turned without sleep, the times he would startle at the sound of a lighter clicking somewhere on the street. Seeing Malik today, standing tall, speaking with such calm and confidence, Jordan knew his son had truly overcome. A teacher quietly came to Jordan, whispering that Malik was no longer just a student, but now an inspiration for the whole school. Jordan smiled, didn't answer right away, only nodded slightly in a knowing agreement. He wasn't seeking recognition for himself, but the moment he saw his son respected and admired like that, his heart warmed. This pride wasn't just a personal joy, but proof that his determination to fight for justice had given Malik a life in which he could walk with his head held high. When the session ended, a group of students lingered around Malik, asking him questions. They were curious not about the incident, but about how he kept his composure, how he didn't let anger take over. Malik answered slowly, as if weighing each word, saying he wasn't always strong, that there were times he wanted to give up, but then he thought about the people who believed in him, who had stood beside him. He didn't want to let them down, and he didn't want to abandon himself. Those words left some of his classmates silent because they came from real experience, not a rehearsed speech. Jordan left the classroom, first standing out in the hallway to give his son more time with his friends. He looked out at the schoolyard where the rows of trees swayed gently in the wind, and was suddenly reminded of the times he had stood in court, facing eyes filled with doubt or hostility. He knew his son had also faced such looks, but had learned to turn them into motivation. And that more than any verdict he had ever helped deliver was what made Jordan proud. When Malik finally stepped out, Jordan simply placed a hand on his shoulder, saying little. The two walked down the hallway together, their footsteps blending with the distant noise from the yard. Malik looked up at his father and smiled, as if silently saying he knew his father had been there, always there, even without needing it spoken aloud. Jordan returned the look with a warmth that told Malik his father's pride didn't lie in defeating Cain, but in the fact that he had become the person he wanted to be, strong, kind, and unbound by painful memories. And so, though neither said it, they both understood this was not just the end of a difficult journey, but the beginning of a new one where Malik would keep walking, guided by the light of his own experience, and Jordan would keep watching quietly but full of pride. After months of noise and tension, the Pierce family's home was finally filled with a different kind of quiet, not the heavy stillness of the days right after the incident, but a calm as gentle as a spring morning. Jordan often woke earlier, made himself a cup of coffee, and sat on the porch where he could see Malik playing basketball with friends down the street. The boy no longer wore white bandages on his hand, his shots now strong and natural, as if he had never endured that painful burn. Sometimes he laughed, sometimes he shouted to a friend, and those lively sounds made Jordan feel with absolute clarity that his son had truly stepped out of the shadows of memory, no longer held captive by fear or trauma. Family dinners had also become livelier. Malik told his father about school, about interesting classes, about joining the debate CC Club ND, even leading a community project team. Jordan listened sometimes, adding a joke, sometimes just nodding with a quiet smile. Evelyn, Malik's mother, would often glance at the two of them and lightly touch Jordan's shoulder, a silent reminder that all his struggles and resolve had brought them to this moment of peace. They didn't speak much about Cain anymore, not because they had forgotten, but because that story had now become part of the family's history, neatly stored away so it could no longer harm the present. Malik had fully recovered not only physically, but emotionally. He took part in sports joint fundraising events for the Children's Protection Fund and even stood before his class to speak about respect and protecting one another. Many teachers remarked that Malik seemed older than his age not only because of the hardships he had faced, but because he had learned to use his story to help others. When someone asked about his scar, he smiled and said it was a reminder of a battle he and his family had won, and a promise to never stay silent in the face of injustice. Jordan had also regained his own rhythm, continuing his work in the justice system, but with a different perspective. He no longer approached cases merely as a public official, but with a sharper focus on those involving children and vulnerable groups. Every time he had to render a judgment, he thought of Malik and the months spent fighting to protect justice for his son. It made him tougher on those who abused power, but also more compassionate toward those in need of a second chance. The Pierce family still occasionally received letters and thanks from people they had never met. There was a letter from a mother in another state saying Malik's story had given her the courage to bring her own child's case to light. There was a message from a group of law students who said they chose to specialize in human rights after following Cain's trial. These words always came unexpectedly, but the family kept each one carefully like pieces of a larger picture of the impact they had made. One afternoon, as the last light of day streamed through the window, Malik sat beside Jordan in the living room and asked if everything had truly ended. Jordan placed a hand on his son's shoulder and said slowly that no, it hadn't, because injustice still existed somewhere out there, but for their family, this was the beginning of a new chapter and where they could live fully without being bound by the past. Malik nodded, his eyes brightening, as if he had understood that justice was not only a verdict, but also the ability to go on living and loving without letting pain choke the heart. That evening, the family sat together on the porch, watching the streetlights come on. Malik rested his chin in his hand, staring into the distance, then turned to ask his father if one day he could help others the way his father had helped him. Jordan smiled and said he had already begun doing that, even if he hadn't realized it yet. Evelyn placed her hand over her son's and told him that every word he shared, every story he told could change someone in ways he might never expect. Malik stayed silent for a few seconds, then smiled, feeling a lightness, as if he had just found a clear direction for himself. For the Pierce family, the light of justice was not something dazzling and blinding. It was like a warm lamp lit in a home after a storm, just bright enough to show the way, just steady enough to remind them that the darkness had receded. And as night fell in the peace they had reclaimed, they knew they would keep that light burning not only for their own family, but for all those seeking to step out of their own shadows. Jordan knew that his family's story could not simply end with a verdict or a few newspaper pages. Sitting in front of the camera for a special television program, he spoke slowly, but with firm conviction that he would not stop at protecting his son, but would keep fighting to make the law a solid shield for all children, regardless of skin color or circumstance. His voice was not loud yet. Each word struck like a hammer on stone, resonating and lingering in the minds of listeners. He said this fight was not a solitary journey, but an invitation for anyone who had seen or experienced injustice to step forward and speak out. When the camera stopped, Jordan turned to Malik, placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his gaze warm, yet filled with determination, as if passing on part of that fire. Malik said nothing, only nodded, but that nod was enough for Jordan to know his son was ready to be part of the journey. The next morning, the city seemed to wear a new calm. Sunlight stretched along the small street leading to the square, glinting off window panes and trees in the midst of changing leaves. Jordan and Malik stepped out of their home without any photo ops or news coverage, just a walk between father and son. Malik carried a basketball, and Jordan held a bottle of water, walking slowly so his son could run ahead and circle back. People recognized them, a few nods, a few friendly smiles, and even words of thanks called out from a cafe along the street. They didn't stop to retell their story because it had already been written, but they kept walking, letting the image seep into people's memories. The image of a father and son walking side by side in the sunlight, no longer victim and protector, but a symbol of resilience and hope. Their shadows stretched long across the sidewalk, blending into the flow of busy passers-by who still turned to look. The warm, golden light made the air feel unusually clear, like a reminder that after every trial, after every scar, there is still a straight road leading to peace. Jordan walked beside Malik occasionally, brushing his son's shoulder while Malik tossed the basketball into the air and caught it, his laughter carrying far. That image was more than just a family moment. It was a living message to anyone fighting for justice, that victory is not only found in a courtroom but also in the steady steps that follow. As they turned the corner, sunlight hit their faces, directly highlighting both their smiles. Jordan knew there would be more roads to travel, more doors to knock on, more hearts to move. But today he allowed himself to savor this moment. And at the end of the street, where their shadows merged with the light, the story closed not with a final period, but with a promise to continue so that the flame of justice would never go out.